Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're not going to rush anywhere. We're going to lie very still and let one of the oldest stories ever told close and around us like a blanket. Before we begin, go ahead and do the small things. Dim the lights, if you haven't already. Pull the covers up just a little higher than feels necessary. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing else you need to understand except this. A very long time ago, people looked up at the night sky, and they did not see emptiness. They saw a body. They saw a woman, impossibly long, arched from one horizon to the other, her fingertips touching the earth in the east, her toes touching the earth in the west, her back curved into the shape of the sky itself. They called her Nut. And every single night, without fail, without asking permission from anyone, she opened her mouth and swallowed the sun whole. Let that settle for a moment. Somewhere above you, right now, if you were standing in a wheat field on the banks of the Nile 4,000 years ago, someone would be telling you the same thing you're about to hear. That the dark isn't empty. That the dark is a body, and you are lying inside it. So take a breath in, and let it go, slow and long, like the tide pulling back from the shore. Tonight, we're not just watching a documentary about ancient Egypt. We're going to spend 2 hours moving through a single night in that world. Through its temples, its workshops, its sick rooms and birthing rooms and mining camps. And we're going to let the goddess above us carry the sun in her belly the entire time. The way she always has, the way she always will, until the two of us reach the morning together. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need them for this. The body of the sky. To understand the Egyptians, you first have to understand that they did not separate the sky from a person the way we do. We say the sky, and we picture an absence, blue in the day, black at night, a kind of nothing that things happen inside of. The Egyptians didn't have that luxury, or maybe they simply didn't want it. To them, the sky was Nut, and Nut was a goddess with a spine, a stomach, a mouth, and a womb, stretched so impossibly far across the heavens that her body became the very shape of night and day. Picture her the way the temple ceilings painted her, over and over, for 3,000 years without much changing. She is bent forward at the waist, her long arms and legs planted on the horizon like the four corners of a tent. Her brother, and in some tellings, her husband, is Geb, the god of the earth, lying beneath her, so close and yet forever separated. Between them, holding them apart with lifted arms, stands their father Shu, the god of air, because the sky and the earth could never be allowed to touch again. Once, long ago, they were pressed together so tightly there was no room for anything else to exist. Shu had to lift his daughter into the air and hold her there, and he has been holding her ever since, every single day, without rest. Doesn't that feel like something worth carrying into sleep tonight? The idea that somewhere, someone has been holding the sky up for you, patiently, for longer than memory reaches? Along Nut's body, the Egyptians painted stars, not scattered randomly, but placed with real care, because to the priests who studied the sky from temple rooftops, the stars weren't just decoration. They were markers of time. Egypt didn't have clocks the way we think of them, but it had something almost as reliable. 36 small constellations called decans, rising one after another along Nut's belly through the night, each one taking its turn to mark an hour passing. A priest standing on a temple roof with a plumb line and a chart could look up at which Decan star had just crested the horizon and know, with real confidence, how many hours remained before dawn. Think about that for a moment as you lie here in your own dark room. Somewhere, a person is always keeping time by watching a body move slowly across the sky. Whether it was a priest on a rooftop in Thebes or the quiet tick of your own phone somewhere nearby, tonight, someone is measuring the same dark you're resting in. The swallowing. Here is the part of the story that gives this whole chapter its name, and it is the part one want you to hold on to as we drift through everything else tonight. Each evening, as the sun, the great god Ra, whom we'll come to know very well later in this journey, reaches the western horizon, Nut opens her mouth and takes him in. Not violently, not as an ending. The Egyptians were very clear that this was something closer to comfort, closer to the sun returning to a mother's body to rest before the work of the next day. Ra enters through Nut's mouth in the west, and travels the length of her, through the long private dark of her body, through what the Egyptians called the Duat, the underworld, the place where 12 hours of night unfold one after another, each with its own trials, its own dangers, its own strange rooms of the dead waiting for the sun to pass through. And then, in the east, 12 hours later, Nut gives birth to him again. Every single sunrise the Egyptians ever saw, every single one their grandparents saw, every single one their great-great-grandparents saw stretching back to the edge of memory, was, to them, literally understood as this goddess being born again from her own mother's body, day after day, forever. There's a phrase carved into the ceiling of more than one Egyptian tomb that essentially translates to this. She swallows him in the evening, and he is reborn from her in the morning, like the sun is reborn every day. It's simple. It's almost matter of fact. And it repeated itself so reliably, for so many thousands of years, that an entire civilization built its sense of time, its sense of safety, its sense of what happens after death, on the quiet certainty that the sky would always do this again tomorrow. You don't have to believe any of it to feel something in it. There is something enormously comforting in imagining the dark not as an absence, but as a body patiently carrying something precious through a long, private passage, with the full intention of releasing it safely on the other side. Tonight, as you drift, you are inside that same passage. You don't need to do anything to get through it. It happens on its own. It always has. The ceiling above the temple. If you had been able to walk into the great temple complex at Dendera, in Upper Egypt, and tilt your head back inside one particular small chapel on the roof, you would have seen Nut painted directly above you. Her body curved across the entire ceiling, stars dotting her skin, the sun disk shone moving along the length of her at different points to represent its daily journey. That chapel was built, in part, specifically so that Nut's nightly swallowing and rebirth of the sun could be enacted and understood as astronomy, as religion, and as reassurance, all at once. The priests who worked beneath that ceiling weren't separating science from myth the way we might be tempted to. When they charted the rising Deccan stars along her body to track the hours of night, they weren't doing something different from honoring the goddess. They were doing the same thing. Watching Nut's body move through the sky was how you told time and how you prayed, in the very same gesture. There's something in that worth taking into your own night. You don't have to separate the practical from the sacred either. The simple act of lying still, breathing slowly, letting the hours pass over you unhurried, that can be both the most ordinary thing in the world, and, if you let it, something a little bit like reverence. A mother who cannot be stopped. There's a detail in the old myths that I think about often, and I want to share it with you now, gently, as we start to settle further in. In one version of the story, Geb, the earth, Nut's husband and brother, becomes furious with her for swallowing their children, the stars, each morning as dawn arrives, and the sky brightens, and the stars fade from view. He accuses her of devouring her own family. But their father Shu steps in and explains what's really happening. She isn't destroying them. She's simply taking them back inside her body during the day, the way she takes the sun in each evening, so that she can give birth to them all again when the dark returns. It was never an ending. It was only ever a very long, very patient rhythm of holding and releasing, that never actually stopped, not even once, across the entire span of Egyptian civilization. I think that's part of why this goddess mattered so much to ordinary people, far more than her quiet, background presence in most museum exhibits might suggest. She wasn't a god you begged for a good harvest or prayed to before a battle. She was simply, reliably, always there, doing the same unglamorous, essential thing every single day, holding the sky up, taking in what needed rest, and letting it go again when it was time. Isn't that a nice thing to fall asleep inside of? The coffin as a small sky. I want to tell you one more thing about Nut before we move further into tonight's journey, because it's the detail that, more than any other, tells you how deeply this goddess lived inside the Egyptian imagination, not just in temples, but in the most private, personal moment a person could imagine, the inside of their own coffin. From the Middle Kingdom onward, it became common for the inside lid of a coffin, the very surface that would rest directly above a person's body, inches from their face, sealed away in the dark of a tomb, to be painted with the image of Nut. Her arms outstretched, her body arched protectively downward, The idea being that the person resting inside wasn't lying in an empty box in the ground. They were lying beneath the sky goddess herself, held the exact same way the sun was held every single night, with the exact same promise that this darkness, too, would end in a rebirth. Think about the comfort in that, for a person facing the end of their life, in a world without the medicine or certainty we take for granted today. To know that the very last thing painted above your face, forever, would be a mother's body curved protectively over you, promising that even this long, silent stretch of darkness would eventually open into morning. You are, right now, lying beneath a version of the same sky. Different stars, maybe, different ceiling, but the same simple, ancient comfort is available to you tonight, if you let it in. The dark is not empty. It is not something to be afraid of, or something you need to fight through alone. It is a shape that holds you gently, that has held countless people before you, exactly like this, and that has never once, in all of recorded history, failed to open into light again by morning. Let your breathing slow a little more. The 5 days that didn't exist. There's an old story about Nut that I've always found strangely moving, and it has to do with something as simple as the length of a year. The Egyptian calendar year was, for most practical purposes, 360 days long, 12 months of 30 days each, tidy and even. But of course, a real year is a little longer than that, and more importantly for our story tonight, 360 was a number that left Nut in an impossible position. According to the myth, the sun god Ra had discovered that Nut and Geb, sky and earth, had fallen in love in secret, and in his anger, he placed a curse on her. She would not be permitted to give birth on any day of the 360 days of the year. Not a single one. Every day already belonged to something else, and none of them would open themselves to her children. Picture the quiet unfairness of that. A mother, already carrying new life inside her, and nowhere in the entire calendar for that life to arrive. So Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, whom we'll spend real time with later tonight, stepped in on her behalf. Thoth was known, among many other things, as a clever gambler, and in this telling, he challenged Khonsu, the moon god, to a game of chance. Some versions say it was a board game. Others say it was a wager over moonlight itself. Whatever the game was, Thoth won, and his winnings were strange and specific. A small sliver of light, taken from the moon each time, until he had gathered enough of it to form 5 entirely new days. Days that existed outside the calendar. Days that belonged to no god's earlier claim, because they hadn't existed when the curse was made. And so, on those 5 new days, days the Egyptians called the epigomenal days, tucked in at the very end of the year, before everything began again, Nut was finally free to give birth. Over those 5 days, one after another, she brought 4 of Egypt's most important gods into the world. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, will meet in our final chapter tonight. His sister and wife Isis, whose search for him becomes one of the most enduring love stories the ancient world ever told. The god Set, whose jealousy would one day be the reason Osiris needed reviving at all. And Nephthys, Isis's quieter sister. In some versions, a 5th day welcomed the falcon god Horus the Elder as well. I like this story for a reason that has nothing to do with mythology and everything to do with what it says about persistence. Nut was told, very plainly, by the most powerful god in the sky, that there was no room for what she needed. And instead of accepting that, an ally found her the room. Not by breaking the rule, but by finding the narrow, patient cracks around it. 5 slivers of moonlight, saved up one at a time, until they were enough. If tonight has felt like it doesn't have room in it, for rest, for quiet, for the simple animal comfort of lying still in the dark, maybe you can borrow a little of that same patience. The room doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it has to be won back, one small sliver at a time, the way Thoth won it for a mother who only wanted somewhere for her children to be born. A ceiling for everyone, not just kings. It's easy to assume, when we talk about painted sky ceilings and golden coffin lids, that Nut belonged only to pharaohs. Those ordinary farmers and bakers and boatmen along the Nile had no real relationship with a goddess this vast, this cosmic, this far above their daily concerns. But that isn't quite true, and I think the truth is gentler and more interesting. Even modest tomb chapels belonging to officials, craftsmen, and their families, people who were comfortable but far from royal, were sometimes decorated with star patterns across the ceiling, a humble echo of the same idea, painted in far greater detail inside a king's burial chamber. A family might not be able to afford a ceiling painted with Nut's full body, arms outstretched from one wall to the other, the way a pharaoh could. But they could afford a field of small yellow stars against dark blue plaster above the place where their loved one would rest. And within that small, affordable gesture was the exact same idea, that the person beneath it was sleeping under the same sky body that held the sun, the same protection that had never once, in all of memory, failed to open into morning. Amulets, too, carried her presence into ordinary homes. Small protective charms, worn by mothers, tucked near sleeping children, buried with the dead, sometimes bore star patterns or her outstretched, protective form, a portable version of the same comfort painted onto temple ceilings and royal coffins. You didn't need to be able to afford a temple to ask the sky to hold you gently through the night. You only needed a small piece of clay or faience, shaped with enough care, and worn close enough to the body, to carry her nearby. I think that's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. The biggest comforts in this story, the idea that darkness always resolves into light, that what's taken in gently is always eventually given back, were never locked away in temples reserved for the powerful. They were available in a small clay charm around anyone's neck. They're available to you right now, in a room that isn't a temple at all, simply because you're willing to lie still and let the story hold you the way it held them, settling in for the long night ahead. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to travel through this world, chapter by chapter, the way the sun travels through Nut's body, unhurried, patient, moving steadily from one small room of history into the next. We'll visit the moon god's temple and the quiet workshops of Memphis. We'll kneel beside a midwife and a physician priestess. We'll walk among temple cats and turquoise miners, crocodile pools and scribes' lamplit libraries, the hushed tint of the embalmers, and finally, the sun's own long and dangerous journey through the 12 hours of night, before we arrive, together, at the very last chapter, the place the Egyptians believed waited for everyone, eventually, on the other side of all this darkness. You don't need to remember any of it. You don't need to stay awake for the ending, though it is, I think, a very beautiful one. Nut doesn't require your attention to keep doing her work. She was going to swallow the sun and give birth to the stars tonight whether you watched or not, the same way she has every night for longer than anyone can count. So let your eyes rest. Let your body sink a little deeper into the mattress beneath you. Somewhere above you, an old goddess with her arms stretched to one horizon and her legs stretched to the other is already beginning her nightly work, taking the light gently into her body, so that it can rest, so that it can be born again. We'll meet the next god together whenever you're ready. There's no rush at all. Chapter 2. Khonsu in the Temple of the Moon. If you're still with me, good. If you've already drifted off somewhere back in the last chapter, that's good too. Nut doesn't mind either way, and neither do I. For those still listening, let's move gently into the next room of this long night. We left the sun resting inside the body of the sky. But the sky at night isn't only the sun's private passage. It also belongs to another traveler, quieter, cooler, patient in a completely different way. Tonight, we turn to Khonsu, the god of the moon, the third member of a family. Khonsu's name is thought to come from an old word meaning traveler or wanderer, and it suited him. Unlike Ra, whose entire identity was built around a single, blazing, unmistakable presence in the sky, Khonsu changed shape constantly. Some nights he was a thin, curved sliver, barely visible above the palm trees. Other nights he was full and round, bright enough to cast shadows across the temple courtyards. The Egyptians didn't see this as an inconsistency in him. They saw it as a kind of honesty. The moon simply showed you, every night, exactly how much of itself it had to give. In the great temple city of Thebes, Khonsu belonged to a family. He was the son of Ammonius, the hidden, powerful king of the gods, and Mut, the vulture-headed mother goddess, forming what's often called the Theban triad. Ammonius Ra ruled the vast complex at Karnak in the daylight hours, his sanctuary so central to Egyptian religious life that pilgrims traveled from across the kingdom to visit it. But tucked within that same sprawling complex stood a smaller temple, dedicated to their sun, and it's there that we're going to spend the rest of this chapter. Once the sun has gone down and Karnak's grand daytime crowds have thinned into a hush. Walking through the gate at night. Picture the approach. During the day, the temple of Khonsu at Karnak, modest compared to the towering halls of his father's sanctuary, but still an imposing structure of its own, with its own pylon gateway and colonnaded court, would have been busy with priests moving between duties, incense smoke curling upward, the low murmur of ritual chanting from somewhere deep inside. But at night, most of that activity settled. The outer gates remained, in certain periods, accessible to those who came seeking something specific, healing. A family might arrive well after dark, having walked from a village some distance away, carrying a child who had been feverish for days, or an elder whose joints had swollen past use. Or, in the case of the most famous story ever told about this temple, someone whose illness seemed to resist every remedy already tried. They wouldn't have approached casually. There would have been a sense of occasion to it. The long walk in darkness itself a kind of offering, proof that they had come seeking the god specifically, deliberately, at the hour when his light, however thin that night, was strongest in the sky. Inside, statues of Khonsu were sometimes given the epithet, Khonsu the Provider, or, in his most powerful healing aspect, Khonsu who gives counsel, a version of the god believed to possess particular authority to drive out illness, especially illness understood as caused by hostile or invasive spirits. A priest might perform a ritual before the statue, reciting spells meant to identify and expel whatever force was causing the sickness, while incense smoke filled the small chamber and the torchlight made the carved eyes of the god seem, for a moment, almost alive. The statue that traveled. There's a story carved onto a large stone slab, what scholars call the Bintresh Stela, that captures just how far Khonsu's reputation for healing was believed to travel, quite literally. According to the inscription, a foreign princess in a distant land had fallen seriously ill, possessed, the text says, by a hostile spirit that ordinary remedies could not touch. Word reached the pharaoh, and eventually a specific, potent form of the god, a statue known as Khonsu the Provider, distinct from the temple's primary image, was sent on an enormous overland journey, escorted with great ceremony, to be brought directly to the princess's side. The story tells us that when the statue arrived and its power was invoked, the spirit troubling the princess spoke, acknowledged Khonsu's authority, and departed peacefully, and a great feast was held in the god's honor before, eventually, his statue was permitted to journey home again, laden with gifts. Whatever the historical truth buried inside that inscription, and scholars have long debated how much of it reflects an actual event versus temple mythmaking. The story tells us something true regardless. That Khonsu's healing power was imagined as something that could travel, that could leave the fixed walls of a single temple and go to where the sickness was, rather than demanding the sickness always come to it. There's something worth carrying into your own night in that. Comfort doesn't always have to be waited for in one fixed place. Sometimes it's already moving toward you, unhurried, the way moonlight moves across a room without ever needing to be summoned twice. Measuring time by a traveler's face. Beyond healing, Khonsu carried another responsibility that touched nearly every household in Egypt, whether or not they ever set foot in his temple. He measured time. The Egyptian civil calendar, the tidy 360-day one we spoke about back in Chapter 1, existed alongside an older, more intimate way of tracking time. The lunar month, watched and counted by the visible changes in Khonsu's own face across the sky. A new moon marked the beginning of a month. The full moon, roughly midway through, often carried its own festival significance. Temple record keepers noted lunar dates alongside civil ones, and certain religious festivals were timed specifically to phases of the moon rather than the fixed civil calendar, meaning they would shift slightly, year to year, exactly the way a person's mood might shift with the sky above them. Think of what that meant for daily life. A farmer deciding when to begin a particular task, a priest calculating the date of an approaching festival, a mother counting the nights until a certain ritual for her child. All of them, at some point, looked up and let Khonsu's changing face answer a question that mattered to them. He wasn't a distant abstraction. He was closer to something like a shared, slowly ticking clock that the entire Nile Valley could see and agree on together, without needing a single shared piece of paper between them. There's something quietly beautiful in a whole civilization organizing itself, in part, around patiently watching one thing get a little smaller, and then, without fail, a little bigger again. No urgency to it. No skipped steps. Just watching, and trusting the rhythm to hold. A child's fever, a mother's vigil. Let's return, for a moment, to that family we imagined walking toward the temple gates in darkness. Picture the mother specifically, sitting now on the packed earth floor of an inner courtyard, her sick child's head resting in her lap, waiting while a priest completes whatever rites the night requires. She has likely been awake for longer than she can easily count. She has likely already tried the remedies available to her at home. Certain herbs, certain prayers murmured privately over the child's small chest. And now she waits in a temple courtyard lit by a handful of oil lamps, under a sky where Khonsu himself, whatever shape he's wearing tonight, watches from above. We don't know her name. We will never know her name. But we know, with real confidence, that women exactly like her existed by the thousands, across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, sitting in exactly this posture, at exactly this hour, waiting on exactly this kind of hope. There is something almost unbearably tender in imagining her now, this far removed from us in time, doing the single most universal thing a parent can do, staying awake so someone she loves doesn't have to be afraid alone. If you are lying here tonight worried about someone, a child, a parent, a friend, even a version of yourself from long ago that still needs looking after, you are, in a very real sense, keeping the same vigil she kept. You don't need a temple for it. You don't even need to stay awake for it. Not really. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone you're worried about is simply to rest yourself, so that whatever strength you have left tomorrow is there when it's needed. The festival of the new moon. Beyond individual healing visits, Khonsu's temple, like most major temples in Egypt, kept its own festival calendar, and among the most consistently observed occasions were the small monthly celebrations tied to the new and full moon. These weren't always the grand, kingdom-wide spectacles that Egypt is famous for. No enormous processions through the streets of Thebes, no crowds numbering in the thousands. Often, they were smaller, quieter, more intimate observances. Offerings renewed at the start of each lunar month. Incense burned in gratitude that the sky's traveler had returned once again from wherever the dark of the new moon had taken him. There's something worth noticing in that scale of ritual. Not every sacred act in ancient Egypt required spectacle. Some of the most consistently practiced devotions were the smallest ones. A bowl of incense lit at the same modest hour every month. A short prayer repeated so many times across a lifetime that it became less like a request and more like breathing. Khonsu, the traveler, the wanderer, the god who was never quite the same shape 2 nights in a row, was honored best not through grand permanence, but through this same small, patient repetition, month after month, for as long as anyone could remember. Maybe that's worth taking with you now, as we prepare to move toward the next chapter. You don't need a grand ritual tonight either. You don't need anything more than what you're already doing. Lying still, breathing slowly, letting a small, quiet repetition of rest carry you forward the same way it carried an entire civilization through every single one of its long nights. The hunter in the older texts. I want to pause here and tell you something that might feel a little surprising, given how gently we've been sitting with Khonsu so far tonight. In the very oldest religious writings we have from Egypt, a collection of spells and hymns carved into the walls of pyramid burial chambers more than 4,000 years ago, which scholars today call the pyramid texts, Khonsu doesn't appear as a gentle healer at all. He appears as something closer to a hunter. In one striking passage, sometimes called the Cannibal Hymn by modern scholars because of its startling imagery, the deceased king is described as consuming the power of the gods themselves in order to become mighty enough for the afterlife. And Khonsu is named specifically as the one who helps him do it. A fierce, capable hunter of gods, someone who lives on hearts, and assists the king's transformation into an overwhelming cosmic force. Its vivid, unsettling language, very far removed from a moonlit temple courtyard and a mother waiting quietly with her sick child. I share this with you not to unsettle your evening, but because I think it says something true and worth sitting with. The same god can hold very different faces across a very long span of time, and neither face has to cancel the other out. The fierce, hungry hunter of the oldest royal burial texts and the patient, healing traveler of the later temple at Karnak are, in the eyes of the people who worship them, the very same god. Power, in this telling, was never only gentle, but gentleness, when it eventually asserted itself more fully in the later stories we've spent most of this chapter with, wasn't a lesser or diminished version of that power either. It was simply the same strength, aimed differently. Something enormous, choosing softness. Maybe that's worth carrying with you tonight too. If any part of you has ever worried that resting, or being gentle with yourself, is somehow a smaller thing than pushing forward, it isn't. It's the same strength, just aimed differently for tonight. Stones borrowed from a fallen sun. There's one more piece of this temple story I want to share before we move on, because I think it's one of the more quietly remarkable details in the whole of Karnak. The temple of Khonsu that pilgrims and sick families would have walked toward at night was largely built during the reign of Ramesses III, more than 1,000 years after the earliest pyramid texts we just spoke about. But when archaeologists and Egyptologists began carefully examining the stone blocks used in its construction, many centuries later, they found something unexpected tucked inside the walls and foundations. Smaller blocks, called talatat, originally carved for entirely different buildings. Structures raised generations earlier during the brief, dramatic reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who had tried, for a short and turbulent period, to reorder Egyptian religion around a single god, the sun disk. Aten, before his monuments were dismantled and his name largely erased from official memory after his death. Those broken, reused fragments of Akhenaten's abandoned religious revolution were quarried apart, and some of them were built directly into the foundations and fill of Khonsu's temple, hidden from view, doing the humble, structural work of holding up walls dedicated to an entirely different vision of the divine than the one they were originally carved for. I find something strangely moving in that. An entire religious movement, once so certain of itself that it tried to rewrite Egypt's whole spiritual world, ended up, a few generations later, broken into pieces and quietly repurposed to help hold up a small moon god's temple. Not erased entirely, not forgotten completely, but folded invisibly into something that continued on long after the original builder's certainty had faded. There's a kind of permanence in that which has nothing to do with being remembered by name. The stone still holds weight. The wall still stands. The temple where a frightened mother waited with her sick child through the night was, in a very real sense, held up in part by the broken pieces of somebody else's abandoned certainty, transformed quietly into shelter. If parts of your own life feel like they've been dismantled and never fully reassembled the way you once planned, maybe there's some comfort in that too. Broken pieces still hold weight. They can still become part of something that shelters someone else, even if it was never the shape you first intended. The priests who never fully slept. Before we leave, I want you to picture one more figure moving through this temple in the deep hours of the night. Not a worried mother, not a sick child, but a priest, alone, beginning a ritual that had almost nothing to do with anyone watching. Egyptian temple priests, across nearly every major cult in the country, followed strict rules of purity before they were permitted to approach a god's inner sanctuary. Multiple times within a single day and night, a priest on duty might be required to bathe in the temple's sacred lake, a rectangular, carefully maintained pool kept specifically for this purpose, often positioned near the temple's outer walls. The water itself was treated with real seriousness, understood to hold a kind of ritual power capable of washing away not just dirt, but the ordinary, mundane residue of the outside world, so that a priest's body and mind arrived at the god's shrine as clean as the moment allowed. At Khonsu's temple, a priest tasked with tending the sanctuary through the night might rise from sleep, or, more likely, from a kind of watchful half-rest, never fully surrendering to unconsciousness, to complete this purification more than once before dawn. He would step into the cool water in near total darkness, the temple silent around him except for the distant call of night birds, shave whatever new stubble had grown since his last purification, since priests were expected to keep their bodies entirely hairless as a further sign of ritual cleanliness, and dress again in fresh linen before returning to his post beside the god's shrine. It's a strange kind of devotion to imagine, choosing, night after night, to interrupt your own rest, alone, unseen by anyone who would ever know or thank you for it, simply because the god you serve deserved to be approached by someone clean, awake, and careful. No audience, no festival crowd, just a single person in cold water in the dark, doing a small, exacting thing correctly for its own sake. There's something in that worth carrying into the rest of your own night, too. Not everything good you do for yourself needs witnesses. The small, careful things, the extra minute of stillness, the breath you let out slowly instead of rushing past it, count exactly as much whether anyone else ever knows about them or not. Leaving the Temple of the Moon. As our imagined family gathers themselves to leave the temple courtyard, the child asleep now, finally, whatever fever had gripped him beginning to loosen its hold. The moon has moved visibly across the sky above them. Time has passed the way it always does here. Unhurried, marked not by a ticking device but by the simple, undeniable fact of a traveler continuing his slow walk overhead. We're going to leave Khonsu's temple now too, and walk a little further into the sleeping city, toward a district where the sound isn't chanting or prayer, but something else entirely, the quiet, patient tapping of chisels against stone, even at this late hour, in the workshops of Memphis. Chapter 3, PTH and the Silent City of Memphis. We're going to leave the moonlit courtyard now, and walk a little further along the riverbank, south from Thebes, until the temples and torchlight of one city fade behind us, and the quiet, densely packed streets of another rise up ahead. This is Memphis. For much of Egyptian history, the administrative heart of the entire kingdom, a city of officials and artisans and enormous stone monuments, and the home of a god who didn't fight, or heal, or hunt, but simply thought the world into being. His name was Ta, a god who made the world by speaking it. Where many creation stories from ancient Egypt describe the world emerging through more physical processes, a mound of earth rising from primordial water, or a god's bodily fluids becoming other gods, the priests of Memphis told a different kind of story about their patron. According to a text now known as the Memphite Theology, inscribed on a stone slab that itself claims to be a copy of a much older, worm-eaten original the pharaoh ordered preserved, Ta created the world through thought and speech alone. Everything that exists, according to this account, first existed as an idea in Ta's heart, which the Egyptians considered the seat of thought and intention, closer to what we might call the mind, and then came into being the instant Ta spoke that idea aloud with his tongue. Heart and tongue, thought and word. In this telling, that simple pairing was powerful enough to bring every other god, every living creature, every city and river and grain of sand into existence. Even the other great gods of Egypt's pantheon, Atum, Ra, the whole crowded, colorful cast of Egyptian mythology, were folded into this story as manifestations of Ta's own creative thought, expressions of an idea he'd conceived and then simply said out loud. I want you to sit with that for a moment, slowly, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your palm. An entire civilization, one of the longest continuous civilizations human beings have ever built, told itself, at least in one of its major cities, that the whole of reality began not with violence or struggle, but with someone thinking carefully, and then speaking gently. Creation, in this version, wasn't a battle. It was closer to a quiet decision, followed by a single, deliberate word. Maybe that's worth carrying into your own night. You don't need force to bring something good into being. Sometimes it only takes a clear thought, held gently, and the quiet decision to let it become real. The city that never fully stopped working. By day, Memphis was one of the most crowded, industrious cities in the ancient world, a place of grain stores and shipyards, government offices and enormous stoneworking yards where blocks destined for tombs, temples, and monuments across the kingdom were shaped, inspected, and prepared for their journeys upriver or across the desert. But even after the sun went down, even after the markets closed and most of the city's population settled into sleep, certain corners of Memphis never fully went quiet. Picture one of the city's larger sculptors' workshops in the deep hours of the night. Half-finished statues stand in rows under moonlight, a pharaoh's face, still rough around the jaw, waiting for tomorrow's careful strokes. A seated scribe, cross-legged, his features already smoothed to a fine polish. A small offering table, its hieroglyphic inscriptions only half carved, waiting patiently for a chisel that has, for tonight, gone still. Stone dust settles in a fine layer across every surface, catching what little light there is. In the corner, an apprentice sleeps. Not in a proper bed, necessarily. Space in a busy workshop was valuable, and young craftsmen learning their trade often lived close to their work, sometimes quite literally among it, curled on a woven mat between the very statues they'd spent the day helping to shape. It wasn't unusual, in a city built around craft, for the boundary between a person's working life and their resting life to blur this completely. The last thing a young apprentice might see before sleep took him was the calm, patient, half-finished face of someone he'd helped bring closer to being real that day. A small, humble echo, without anyone necessarily intending it, of Ta's own method of creation, an idea, not yet finished, resting quietly in the dark, waiting for tomorrow's breath and word to carry it the rest of the way into being. The greatest of the directors of craftsmen, Ta's high priest in Memphis carried a title unlike any other chief priest in Egypt, W.R. Karapemu, usually translated as greatest of the directors of craftsmen. Where the high priests of other major gods might carry titles emphasizing purity or closeness to the divine, or mastery of ritual, Ta's chief priest was, by his very title, positioned as the supervisor of Egypt's makers, sculptors, metalworkers, jewelers, builders, anyone whose hands shaped raw material into something intentional. This wasn't only a religious position. Under this title's authority, at least in earlier periods of Egyptian history, fell a real and practical responsibility for organizing and overseeing the craftsmen of Memphis and, by extension, much of the skilled labor that produced the kingdom's temples, tombs, and royal monuments. Devotion to Ta, in other words, wasn't separated from the practical business of making things well. To honor him properly wasn't only to burn incense before his statue. It was to cut a clean line into limestone, to fit two blocks together so precisely that no gap remained, to finish a piece of work with the same unhurried care that Ta himself was believed to have used when he first spoke the world into being. There's a lovely dignity in that idea, if you let yourself sit with it. Somewhere in ancient Memphis, a stonemason smoothing the final edge of a temple doorway believed, genuinely, that this careful, unglamorous, repetitive work was itself a form of prayer, not a distraction from something more sacred happening elsewhere. The sacred thing, happening exactly there, in his hands, at that hour. Ta, Soker, and Osiris, three gods, one quiet figure. As Egyptian religion developed over the centuries, Ta's identity gradually merged, in certain contexts, with two other significant gods. Soker, an old falcon-headed god closely tied to the necropolis and the realm of the dead around Memphis, and Osiris himself, whom we'll meet properly in our final chapter tonight as the great god of resurrection and the afterlife. Together, this composite figure, often called Tasoker Osiris, became one of the most popular protective deities represented in Egyptian tombs, especially in the later periods of Egyptian history, appearing as small, carefully carved statuettes placed among a person's burial goods. These statuettes are strange and beautiful objects if you've ever seen one in a museum case. Often shown as a mummified figure, sometimes with a cavity inside the base designed to hold a small papyrus scroll or other funerary text, Tasoker Osiris figures combine the creative, foundational power of Memphis's craftsman creator with the ancient necropolis god's authority over the realm of the dead, and with Osiris's own promise of resurrection. The very idea Nut herself embodies every single night when she swallows the sun only to give birth to it again by morning. I find something quietly moving in the fact that a god best known for careful, patient craftsmanship, for the slow, exacting work of shaping raw stone into something intentional, eventually became, in this merged form, one of the figures ancient Egyptians most trusted to help shape their own passage into whatever came after death. The same steady hands that finished a temple doorway, in this way of thinking, were trusted to finish a person too, carrying them gently the rest of the way into whatever new form waited on the other side. The bull who lived among them. Before we leave Memphis for the night, There's one more piece of this city's devotion I want to share with you, because it's one of the more remarkable and, frankly, tender details in the whole of Egyptian religion. Closely associated with Ptah was a living bull, chosen through an elaborate process involving very specific markings believed to identify him as sacred, and known as the Apis bull. Once identified, this particular animal wasn't treated as ordinary livestock in any sense. He was housed in dedicated quarters near Ptah's great temple, attended by his own priests, fed a carefully managed diet, and treated, quite genuinely, as a living manifestation of divine power walking among the people of Memphis. Crowds are recorded gathering simply to watch the Apis bull move through the city on certain occasions, reading meaning into which direction he turned, which gestures he seemed to make, as a kind of oracle. And when, eventually, each Apis bull died, usually after some years of this extraordinary, carefully tended life, he wasn't discarded or forgotten. He was mummified with the same enormous care given to a pharaoh and laid to rest in a vast underground necropolis at Saqqara, in massive stone sarcophagi, some weighing many tons apiece, prepared for a bull the way other cultures might only prepare for a king. I think what moves me about this isn't the ceremony itself, impressive as it was, but the underlying instinct behind it. The idea that the sacred could live, breathe, eat, and walk among ordinary people in the most literal way imaginable, not confined to statues or temple sanctuaries at all, but present, physically, in the same dusty streets where an apprentice slept among half-finished statues and a stonemason smoothed his final careful edge for the day. Divinity, in Memphis, wasn't only something you approached. Sometimes, it simply walked past you in the street, and you were invited to notice. The name hidden inside a name. Here's a small detail I want to give you before we move on, because I think it's one of those quiet facts that changes how you see something you thought you already understood. The word we use today, Egypt, almost certainly doesn't come from anything the Egyptians themselves called their own country. Their own name for their land was closer to Kemet, the Black Land, a reference to the rich dark soil left behind each year by the Nile's flooding. The word Egypt instead traces back, through Greek, to a phrase used for one particular temple complex, Hut-Ka, meaning something like the mansion of the spirit of Ptah, the very temple precinct we've been walking through tonight, here in Memphis. Greek travelers and traders, encountering Memphis as one of the first and most important cities they came into contact with along the Nile, adopted a version of this temple's name, filtering it through their own language until it became something closer to Egyptos, and eventually applied that name to the entire country, not just the one temple complex it originally described. Centuries later, that Greek word passed into Latin, and eventually into English, until an entire nation, one of the oldest continuous nations in human history, came to be known to most of the world by a name that literally means, if you trace it back far enough, the house of Ptah's spirit. I find that remarkable to sit with. Somewhere in the deep background of a word so ordinary that most of us have said it 1,000 times without a second thought. Egypt. There's a quiet god of craftsmen and creation, still present, still named, folded invisibly into a word used by people who will never once think of him by name. His temple gave its name to an entire civilization, the way a single quiet idea, spoken carefully enough, can end up shaping far more than anyone standing at the beginning of it could have guessed. The god who stood still. If you were to look at how Egyptian artists chose to depict Ptah, compared to nearly any other major god in their pantheon, you'd notice something immediately. He doesn't move. Where Horus is often shown mid-flight, wings outstretched, or Sekhmet, whom we'll meet a little later tonight, appears with her lioness head thrown back in evident ferocity, or Ra crosses the sky in an active, forward-leaning solar bark. Ptah is almost always shown the same way, in nearly every surviving image across thousands of years, standing perfectly upright, wrapped tightly in what resembles mummy bandages from the shoulders down, his arms emerging only enough to hold a single tall staff in front of him, his feet planted together, unmoving, on a small platform. Even his face carries an expression of complete, settled calm. That staff he holds is itself a combination of three separate, older symbols merged into one. The scepter, representing power and dominion, the Ankh, representing life, and the Jed pillar, representing stability and endurance. Three of the most important concepts in the entire Egyptian religious imagination fused into a single object, held perfectly still in the hands of a god who himself never runs, never fights, never visibly exerts effort of any kind. I think that stillness was the entire point. Tut didn't need to move to demonstrate his power, because his power had never been about motion in the first place. It was about the quiet, settled confidence of an idea that had already been thought all the way through, and a word that had already been spoken with full certainty. There was nothing left to rush toward. The world he'd imagined was already here. There's a real lesson in that kind of stillness, I think, especially at this hour of the night. You don't have to be doing something dramatic right now to be doing something powerful. Simply lying still, breathing evenly, trusting that what needed to be set into motion already has been. That can be its own quiet, complete kind of strength, the same unmoving strength this god has carried, staff in hand, feet planted, for over 4,000 years. Found again, centuries later. I want to close this chapter with one more story, this one much closer to our own time, because I think it says something gentle about how carefully some things wait to be remembered. For close to 2,000 years after the last Apis bull was laid to rest at Saqqara, the exact location of that vast underground burial complex, the one holding those massive stone sarcophagi we spoke of a moment ago, had been lost. Sand had drifted over its entrance. Memory of it survived only in a handful of old written descriptions, including one left by the ancient Greek geographer Strabo, who visited Egypt around 2,000 years ago and mentioned a long avenue of sphinxes leading toward a sacred site connected to the Apis cult. In 1850, a young French Egyptologist named Auguste Mariette, walking the sands near Saqqara, noticed the head of a half-buried sphinx protruding from a dune. A single, weathered stone face, worn nearly smooth, looking up at him from beneath centuries of drifted sand. Remembering Strabo's old description, Mariette began to dig. What he eventually uncovered was extraordinary. The long-lost avenue of sphinxes, and beneath it, still largely intact, the underground galleries of the Serapeum, containing enormous granite and basalt sarcophagi, many of them still sealed, some holding the mummified remains of Apis bulls, undisturbed since they had been placed there by priests who had lived and worked and slept in this very city we've been walking through tonight. I think about that single sphinx head, sitting quietly beneath the sand for close to 2,000 years, patient in a way that has nothing to do with waiting for anything in particular, simply resting there, unhurried, until, eventually, without any effort of its own, it was found again. It didn't need to call attention to itself. It didn't need to fight against the sand that had settled over it. It simply remained, exactly as it was, until the right person happened to be walking past at the right moment, ready to notice. There's something worth carrying into your own rest tonight in that image, I think. You don't have to strive, right now, to be understood, or finished, or found. You're allowed to simply be still beneath whatever has settled gently over you this evening. The blankets, the quiet, the low hum of this story, trusting that nothing true about you is lost simply because, for tonight, it's resting out of sight. The city settles. As the deepest hours of the night settle fully over Memphis, even the workshops eventually fall still. The apprentice sleeping among the statues doesn't stir. The half-finished pharaoh's face waits, patient, for morning light. Somewhere nearby, in his own dedicated quarters, the Apis bull rests too, watched over by attendants who, like the priest we left tending Khonsu's shrine, may never fully surrender to sleep themselves. There's a stillness to a city built around careful making. Once the making has finally paused for the night, nothing rushes to be finished. Everything simply waits, unhurried, the way an idea waits quietly in someone's heart before it's ready to be spoken. We're going to leave the workshops now and walk toward a much smaller, much quieter room. Not a temple, not a workshop, but an ordinary home, where a woman is about to become a mother for the first time, and where a very different kind of goddess is about to make her presence gently known. Chapter 4. Mescanet and the Birthing Bricks. Narrator. Let's leave the workshops of Memphis behind now, and step into somewhere much smaller. Not a temple, not a sacred lake or a sculptor's yard. Just a single room, in an ordinary home, where something enormous is about to happen to one very ordinary family. Tonight, we meet Meskenet, a goddess who almost never appears in grand temple reliefs beside pharaohs, who has no towering sanctuary of her own that survives for us to walk through, and who was, despite all of that, one of the most personally, urgently important deities an ancient Egyptian woman would ever call upon in her life. A goddess made of mud and straw. Meskenet's most common form wasn't even a human body, at least not entirely. She was often represented as a birthing brick, quite literally, a rectangular block of sun-dried mud and chopped straw, the exact same humble material used across Egypt for building ordinary houses, sometimes shown with a small human head and arms emerging from one end, as though the goddess herself lived inside this simple, everyday object. The birth brick wasn't a symbolic idea only. It was a real, physical tool used during actual childbirth. Egyptian women, when the time came to give birth, did not typically lie down the way birth is often depicted in later Western art and medicine. Instead, they squatted, using gravity to help the process along, often with their feet planted on a pair of these low mud bricks, which elevated and stabilized their footing during the physically demanding hours of labor. In this quite literal, physical sense, Meskenet was present at the birth of nearly every child in ancient Egypt, not as a distant figure watching from the sky, but as the very ground a mother stood on, the surface bearing her weight during the hardest and most dangerous work her body would ever do. We know this practice wasn't just later assumption or guesswork on the part of Egyptologists. In 2001, an archaeological team excavating a house in Abydos dating back roughly to 1700 BCE uncovered an actual birth brick, remarkably preserved, painted along its sides with vivid scenes. A mother seated with her newborn, attended by protective goddesses and figures, imagery meant to invoke exactly the kind of divine protection a family would have prayed for during those hours. It remains one of the only physical birth bricks ever recovered intact, and it lets us picture, with unusual clarity, the very object a real woman once stood on, in a real house, during one of the most vulnerable nights of her life. The fate woven at the same moment. Meskenet's role went beyond the purely physical, though. She was also understood as a goddess of fate, specifically, the fate assigned to a person at the precise moment of their birth. In several surviving Egyptian texts, Meskenet appears at the birth of significant figures, present at the exact instant of arrival, already speaking or gesturing to determine something about the character or destiny the newborn would carry through the rest of their life. One of the more vivid appearances of this idea comes from a story preserved in a document known as the Papyrus Westcar, which contains a set of tales about magic and the royal family. In one episode, several goddesses, including Meskenet, disguised themselves as traveling musicians and dancers in order to attend the birth of 3 future kings, secretly present in the room to bless and determine the fate of children whose mother has no idea what extraordinary company has just arrived to help her through her labor. I love the tenderness folded into that story. A mother, exhausted, frightened, focused entirely on the enormous physical task in front of her, completely unaware that the fate of her children is being quietly, carefully arranged in the very same room, by visitors who look, to her eyes, like nothing more than a small group of women who happen to arrive at the right moment to help. Isn't that sometimes exactly how the most important help arrives? Not announced with any fanfare, not recognizable, in the moment, as anything more than an ordinary presence in the room. Simply there, quietly doing essential work, while the person at the center of it all is too consumed by the immediate task to notice anything beyond it. For goddesses in one small room, Meskenet rarely worked entirely alone in the Egyptian imagination. Egyptian birth was often understood as attended by a small company of protective female forces, each with her own specific role. Heket, a goddess shown with the head of a frog, an animal the Egyptians associated with the explosive fertility of the Nile's flood season, when frogs seemed to appear everywhere almost overnight, was believed to breathe life into the child at the final moment. Isis and her sister Nephthys, whom we've already met briefly through the story of Nut's 5 stolen days, were frequently invoked as protective presences as well, their own mythology deeply tied to themes of mourning, searching, and ultimately restoring life, made them natural guardians to call upon during the dangerous, liminal hours of labor. Picture, then, Not a single goddess standing at the foot of a birthing brick, but a small, layered gathering of them. Mescanet underfoot, quite literally, in the brick itself, Hecate's frog-headed presence invoked to draw the first breath. Isis and Nephthys watching over the whole event like the protective, grieving-turned-triumphant sisters they were in their own mythology. An ordinary Egyptian household, in the middle of an ordinary night, could become, for a few intense hours, one of the most densely sacred spaces in the entire cosmos, simply because a new life was arriving. Wisdom passed from a father to a son. There's a surviving piece of Egyptian wisdom literature called the Instructions of Eni, a text structured as advice from a father to his son, covering everything from proper conduct to respect for one's mother. That includes a passage reflecting on Mescanet's role in shaping a person's character and circumstances from birth. The text doesn't treat fate as something rigid or cruelly fixed, exactly, but it does acknowledge, with real honesty, that some of what a person carries through life was already present, already given shape, at the very moment Mescanet stood present at their birth. There's something worth sitting within that kind of honesty, especially at this hour, especially if any part of tonight has carried you toward thinking about your own life, your own beginnings, the parts of yourself that have always simply felt like they were there from the start. The Egyptians didn't need every part of a person's story to be something they'd chosen or earned. Some of it, they believed, quite simply, arrived with you, handed to you gently, by a goddess made of the same humble mud and straw that built the walls of your very first home. The potter's wheel and the shape of a body. Mescanet rarely worked entirely alone in a mythological sense either. Alongside her, in the fuller Egyptian understanding of how a new person came into being, stood Khnum, a ram-headed god associated with the source of the Nile, and, more specifically, with creation through craftsmanship of an unusually intimate kind. Khnum was believed to shape each individual human body, and their Ka, a subtle, essential part of the self, something like a life force or spiritual double that accompanied a person from birth. On a potter's wheel, molding flesh and spirit together from Nile clay the same patient way a craftsman in Memphis might shape a jar or a statue. In this fuller picture, then, a newborn arriving in Egypt had already passed through the careful attention of at least two gods before ever taking a first breath. Khnum, shaping the body and its Ka on his wheel, unhurried and exact, and Mescanet, standing ready at the moment of arrival to receive that shaped form into the world and set its fate in motion. Hecate, the frog-headed goddess we mentioned a moment ago, was closely associated with Khnum as well, in some traditions considered his wife. Her role often understood as the one who breathed the final spark of life into the clay body he had so carefully formed, the last small gift that turned careful craftsmanship into an actual, living, breathing person. I think there's something worth holding on to in the idea of a body being made this carefully, this deliberately, before it ever draws its first breath. Not rushed, not assembled carelessly, shaped slowly, on a wheel, by someone who had all the time they needed, and who wasn't finished until the shape felt right. When a family prayed for a kinder fate, because Mescanet's presence at birth was believed to set real, lasting fate into motion, families didn't simply treat her as an abstract, distant force to be acknowledged and then forgotten. In the period leading up to a birth, and sometimes for a period afterward, offerings and small prayers were directed toward her specifically, in the hope, however modest, however uncertain of success, that a gentler, more fortunate fate might be shaped for the child about to arrive, or the child who had just arrived. This wasn't understood as a way of overriding fate entirely. The Egyptians, on the whole, don't seem to have believed that devotion alone could simply erase whatever Mescanet had determined. But there was real room in their thinking for the idea that sincere care, attention, and ritual respect paid toward the goddess responsible for a person's beginning might soften the sharper edges of what waited ahead, the way careful tending of a young plant, even one whose eventual size and shape are already somewhat determined by its nature, can still meaningfully affect how well it grows. There's a kind of realism in that I find comforting rather than bleak. Not every hard thing in a life can be prevented through devotion or effort alone, but care still matters. Attention still matters. Tending something gently, even when you can't fully control its shape, still shapes it. A little, in ways that count, even against a fate that was already partly set in motion the night you arrived. The woman who had done this before. Behind every household shrine to Mescanet, every carefully placed birth brick, there was almost always a real, living, experienced woman guiding the actual work of labor. A midwife, though the Egyptians likely wouldn't have used quite that word. Simply someone in the community, often older, often a mother or grandmother many times over herself, whose hands had done this work enough times to move with real, practiced calm through even the most frightening hours. She would have known, through long experience rather than any written medical text, which herbal preparations might ease pain or encourage labor along, how to reposition a mother whose labor had stalled, how to recognize, with a trained eye, the difference between an ordinary, difficult stretch of labor and something more dangerous that required more urgent intervention. She would have sung, too, probably, soft, rhythmic songs meant less to entertain and more to give the labor a steady pulse to move through, the way a rower might sing to keep time with the oars. We don't know most of these women's names. History rarely wrote them down, focused as it so often was on kings and priests and grand temple inscriptions instead. But we know, with complete confidence, that women exactly like this existed in every single village along the Nile, in every single generation, quietly holding the most essential knowledge their community possessed, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, without ever needing a temple of their own to make that knowledge sacred. The name that made a person real. There's one more small ritual worth mentioning before we let this family rest, because it closes the circle Mescanet began the moment this child arrived. For the Egyptians, a name wasn't simply a convenient label attached to a person for the sake of other people's convenience. A name was believed to be a genuine, essential part of a person's being, closely tied to their ka. The same subtle life force Khnum was believed to shape on his potter's wheel. So essential, in fact, that erasing someone's name from a monument or inscription was considered a real, serious act of harm against them, capable of threatening their continued existence in memory and, some believed, even in the afterlife. To be named, properly and deliberately, was to be made fully, securely real in a way that went beyond the merely practical. Some days after birth, the exact timing likely varied by family, region, and period. A name would be formally chosen and spoken over the child, often invoking the protection of a goddess named Renanudit, sometimes shown as a cobra or a woman with a cobra's head, associated with nursing, nourishment, and the harvest that would go on to sustain this child's growing body for years to come. Renanudit's name itself is thought to relate to the idea of a nurse, or one who rears, and her presence at this stage of a child's earliest days linked the goddess who fed Egypt's fields to the far more intimate task of feeding this one particular new person safely through their most fragile early weeks. Picture the small ceremony this might have involved. Nothing grand, likely, in most ordinary households. A few close family members gathered, a name spoken aloud, deliberately, the way Ptah himself was believed to have spoken the entire world into being back in Memphis. And with that name spoken, the process Mescanet began at the birth brick reached its quiet completion. A body shaped by Khnum, breathed into life by Heket, met at arrival by Mescanet, and now, finally, made fully and permanently real by Renanudit's blessing and a name someone loved enough to choose carefully. There's something worth holding on to in that layered, patient process, especially tonight. Nothing about becoming fully, securely yourself happened all at once, even for a newborn surrounded by an entire company of attentive goddesses. It happened in stages. Shape, then breath, then presence, then, finally, a name spoken with care. You're allowed exactly the same patience with yourself tonight. You don't have to have arrived at every part of your own name yet. You're allowed to still be, gently, quietly, in the process of becoming real. A bowl of water, a quiet thank you. Let's return, one last time, to the small room we began this chapter in. The hardest hours have passed now. A child rests, finally, against their mother's chest, and the birth brick that bore her weight through labor sits quietly in the corner, its work, for tonight, complete. In households that could manage it, a small offering might be left near that brick in gratitude. A bowl of water, a few beads, sometimes nothing more than a whispered word of thanks directed at an object that, to anyone glancing in from outside, would look like nothing more than an ordinary block of dried mud. But to the family inside that room, it had just quietly done one of the most important things any object in their entire home would ever do. We're going to leave this family to their rest now, mother and newborn both finally settling into the kind of deep, earned sleep that follows enormous effort. And we're going to walk toward another kind of care entirely. Not the beginning of a life this time, but the careful tending of one that's grown sick, inside the halls of a goddess whose temper could be as fierce as her healing was gentle. Chapter 5. Sekhmet and the Physicians of Her House. Narrator. We're going to walk now toward a very different kind of temple, one that, on the surface, might sound like an unlikely place to find comfort. This is the house of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, a deity the Egyptians associated with plague, fever, and destruction. And yet, strangely, wonderfully, her temple was also one of the most important places in all of Egypt to go looking for healing. Let your breathing stay slow as we enter. There's nothing here to fear tonight, only balance. The eye that nearly ended everything. Sekhmet's name means, roughly, the powerful one, and the Egyptians didn't consider that an exaggeration. She was often described as the daughter of Ra, or as an aspect of his own eye, the fierce, protective, destructive force the sun god could send out into the world when he judged that humanity needed correcting. The most famous story about her, sometimes called the myth of the destruction of mankind, tells us exactly how dangerous that force could become once unleashed. According to the tale, Ra, grown old and weary, discovered that humanity had begun plotting against him, whispering rebellion in dark corners where they thought the aging sun god couldn't hear. Furious and wounded by the betrayal, Ra sent his eye down to earth in the form of Sekhmet, instructing her to punish the offenders. Sekhmet did not punish gently. She tore through the land as a lioness unleashed, wading through the people in what the old texts describe in genuinely brutal terms. Blood, the texts say, ran in rivers, and still she wasn't finished, her hunger for destruction growing rather than fading the longer it continued. Watching from above, Ra realized, with real alarm, that he had set something in motion that might not stop until humanity was entirely wiped from the earth, and that his own daughter, once loosed, showed no natural inclination to call herself back. So the gods devised a trick. They brewed an enormous quantity of beer, thousands of jars, the old accounts say, and dyed it deep red with a plant pigment, or in some versions with ochre, until it looked, unmistakably, like blood. This crimson beer was poured out across the field Sekhmet was rampaging through, flooding the land in front of her path. Believing it to be the blood of her victims, she drank it eagerly, again and again, until, mercifully, she grew too drunk to continue her rampage, fell into a deep sleep, and woke sometime later transformed. Calmer, gentler, her fury spent and replaced, at least for a while, by something closer to contentment. I want you to notice something about how this story chooses to end its most violent chapter, not with a battle, not with a stronger force overpowering her, but with rest. Sekhmet's destruction wasn't defeated. It was exhausted, gently, deliberately, until sleep itself became the thing powerful enough to turn her fury back into balance. If that isn't a story worth carrying into your own night, I'm not sure what is. One goddess, two faces. Because of this story, and others like it, Sekhmet came to be understood by the Egyptians in a way that might feel, at first, contradictory. She was simultaneously the force capable of sending plague and fever sweeping through a population, and the force with the power to hold that same plague back, or lift it once it arrived. Illness itself, in the Egyptian imagination, was often specifically described as the messengers of Sekhmet, invisible agents she could dispatch to cause suffering, or, just as easily, recall. This is precisely why her temples doubled, quite functionally, as centers of medicine. If Sekhmet was the source of an illness, it followed naturally that Sekhmet's own priests, working within her own sanctuary, were among the people best positioned to negotiate its end. There wasn't a meaningful separation in ancient Egyptian thought between religious devotion and medical practice the way we might expect today. To treat a patient was, quite literally, to intervene in that patient's relationship with a goddess, soothing her, honoring her, persuading her, through ritual and remedy together, to recall whatever messenger she had sent. The priest, who was also a doctor, The priests of Sekhmet, sometimes referred to in surviving texts by a title meaning something like priest of Sekhmet, or associated closely with the broader class of Wab priests, a term meaning ritually pure, functioned, for much of Egyptian history, as the closest thing the ancient world had to trained physicians. Surviving medical papyri, including the famous Ebers Papyrus, a lengthy collection of remedies, diagnoses, and treatments dating back over 3,000 years, show us that these priest-physicians worked with a genuinely sophisticated body of practical medical knowledge, alongside the ritual and magical elements we might expect from a temple context. A patient visiting Sekhmet's temple with a persistent fever, an infected wound, or an unexplained ailment might receive treatment that, to our eyes, would look strikingly practical. Clean bandages, herbal poultices, remedies made from ingredients like honey, valued not just as a sweetener, but as an early antibacterial treatment, since honey's natural properties do genuinely inhibit certain bacterial growth, alongside recitations and spells meant to address the illness on a spiritual level. As well, the two approaches weren't seen as competing with each other. They were understood as two necessary halves of the same careful treatment, the practical hand and the spiritual voice working in the very same gesture, much like Ptah's heart and tongue back in Memphis. Picture a physician-priest, deep in the temple at night, sitting beside a patient whose fever hasn't yet broken, gently changing a dressing with one hand while murmuring an old, memorized incantation with the other, entirely unconcerned with whether we, thousands of years later, would call this medicine or magic. To him, there was no meaningful difference. There was simply the whole and complete work of healing, approached from every angle available. 700 statues for every day of the year. Perhaps nowhere is Sekhmet's dual nature, destroyer and healer, held in the same body, expressed more powerfully than at the vast precinct of the goddess Mut at Karnak, where the pharaoh Amenhotep III commissioned an almost unbelievable number of statues of Sekhmet. Estimates suggest as many as 700, carved from dark granodiorite, each showing her seated or standing, lioness-headed, holding an egg, a solar disk resting above her brow. Scholars still debate the exact purpose behind commissioning quite so many nearly identical statues, but one compelling theory ties them to a kind of continuous protective ritual. Perhaps one statue honored, in turn, for each day of the Egyptian year, a rolling, unbroken cycle of appeasement meant to ensure that Sekhmet's calmer, healing face remained turned toward Egypt every single day, with no gap left open for her fiercer aspect to slip back through unchecked. Imagine walking through that precinct at night, torchlight catching the dark stone of statue after statue after statue, lioness face after lioness face, stretching further than you could easily count, every single one representing a day someone, long ago, had specifically and deliberately asked to be kept safe. There is something almost hypnotic in that kind of repetition. The same careful gesture of protection, offered again and again, without pause, for as many days as a year could hold. The goddess who wandered too far. The story of Ra's furious eye rampaging across the earth wasn't the only tale the Egyptians told about this volatile, powerful force. In a related and equally beloved myth, sometimes called the story of the distant goddess, the fierce eye of Ra, depicted in different versions as Sekhmet, or as the similarly lioness-associated goddess Tefnut, grows angry with her father for some perceived slight and storms away from Egypt entirely, retreating deep into the wilderness of Nubia, far to the south, taking her protective, dangerous power with her. Without her, Egypt suffers. The land, the story tells us, becomes vulnerable, unprotected, diminished by her absence in ways both practical and spiritual. Ra, missing his fierce daughter and increasingly concerned for his kingdom, sends messengers to coax her home. Often Thoth, the clever, patient god of wisdom we've already met once tonight through his gambling with Khonsu, and who appears again and again throughout Egyptian mythology as the god most willing to do the slow, careful work of persuasion that other gods find beneath them. Thoth doesn't attempt to overpower her or command her back through force. Instead, he approaches gently, disguised sometimes as a baboon, and talks with her. He tells her stories. He reminds her, patiently, of what waits for her at home. Different versions of the myth describe this process taking real time, not a single conversation, but an unhurried journey back toward Egypt, marked along the way by dancing, music, and drinking, until, by the time she finally crosses back into Egyptian territory, her fury has softened into something closer to joy, and she's sometimes said to transform, at this point in the story, from her fierce lioness form into the far gentler figure of a goddess we'll spend real time with in our very next chapter. I find something worth holding on to in the shape of that journey. Nobody rushed her back. Nobody demanded she simply stop being angry on command. She was allowed to wander, to feel whatever she needed to feel, fully and at her own pace. And she was coaxed home not through pressure, but through patient company, familiar stories, and the simple, repeated reminder that she was wanted back. If any part of your own evening has carried some restlessness, some distance you're still traveling back from, there's no need to rush that either. You're allowed exactly the same patient, unhurried journey home. Marks left on an ordinary doorway. Because Sekhmet's messengers of illness were understood as a real and constant threat, ordinary Egyptian households didn't rely solely on temple visits during moments of active sickness. Protective measures were woven into daily life more broadly, a kind of quiet, ongoing precaution against a danger that could, in theory, arrive at any time. Small amulets bearing Sekhmet's lioness form, or inscribed with protective spells invoking her more benevolent aspect, were worn by individuals hoping to keep her fiercer messengers at bay. Certain protective texts and spells, some later gathered into collections we now call the Metternich Stela and similar objects, combine mythological narrative with practical incantation, meant to be recited over a sick person or even, in some cases, inscribed and worn as portable protection against everything from scorpion stings to fever. There's a particular kind of comfort, I think, in a civilization that didn't treat illness as something to simply be endured helplessly, waiting for fate to decide the outcome. The Egyptians armed their homes, their bodies, their doorways with careful, deliberate protection, layer after layer of it. Not because they were certain it would always work, but because doing something, anything, deliberate and caring in the face of danger felt better, and perhaps genuinely was better, than doing nothing at all. Maybe you've got your own version of that tonight. The specific way you've arranged your pillow, the particular thought you return to when your mind starts wandering somewhere unhelpful, the small, private ritual that isn't really about superstition at all, but about giving yourself something deliberate to hold on to in the dark. That instinct is a very old one. You're in very good company tonight. The festival that remembered the beer. Once a year, Egypt held a festival specifically in memory of the moment Sekhmet's rampage was finally, gently ended. An occasion sometimes called the Festival of Drunkenness, and archaeologists working at the Mut precinct in Karnak, the same precinct home to those hundreds of Sekhmet statues we spoke about earlier, have found real physical evidence of it. The remains of a large temporary structure, along with unusually high concentrations of pottery associated with drinking, suggesting that participants gathered there to reenact, quite deliberately, the myth's turning point. Drinking beer, sometimes reddened just as the original divine beer was said to have been, until intoxication carried them into a state the Egyptians associated with sacred, altered awareness, followed by a period of music, drumming, and eventually, sleep. The festival wasn't understood as simple indulgence for its own sake, disconnected from anything sacred. It was a deliberate, communal reenactment of the exact mechanism that had once saved humanity, drinking, deeply and purposefully, until fury softened into rest. Participants would wake the following morning, the old accounts and modern archaeological interpretation both suggest, and be led in procession before an image of the goddess, now understood to be in her gentler, more benevolent aspect, the transformation the myth describes having been ritually reenacted in their own bodies, over the course of a single shared night. There's something almost tender in imagining an entire community choosing, once a year, to fall asleep together on purpose, trusting that whatever fury or difficulty the year had carried would soften by mourning the same way the goddesses had, not through force, not through struggle, but through rest, allowed fully and without apology. If tonight is, in its own small way, your own private version of that old festival, that's all right. You're allowed exactly the same soft ending the goddess herself was given. Sleep first, and whatever gentler morning follows, second. the fever that finally breaks. Let's return, briefly, to our imagined patient, resting now in the quiet hours of the temple, the priest-physician's remedies applied, the incantations spoken. Sometime in the depth of the night, the fever that had gripped them for days finally, gently, begins to break. Sweat cools on their skin. Their breathing slows and deepens. Whatever messenger Sekhmet had sent seems, at last, to be turning back. There's no dramatic moment marking this shift, most likely. No sudden burst of light, no audible voice. Just the quiet, unremarkable, deeply welcome sensation of a body settling back into itself, hour by hour. The way any real recovery actually happens, slowly, without spectacle, simply because enough careful attention, from enough directions, was finally given enough time to do its work. If any part of you tonight is carrying something that needs healing, in your body, or somewhere quieter, harder to name, I hope you can let yourself borrow a little of that same patience. Healing rarely announces itself all at once. It arrives the way Sekhmet's fury finally did, all those centuries ago, gently exhausted into rest, until what's left, eventually, is calm. We're going to leave the temple now, and walk toward one more household, this one much smaller and considerably less fierce, the home of a goddess who protects not through plague or fever, but through something closer to quiet, watchful company. Chapter 6. Bastet and the Temple Cats of Bubastis. Narrator. We've traveled a long way through this night already, from the sky goddess who opened our eyes, through moonlit healing and silent workshops, past a birthing brick and a fever finally breaking. Now we arrive somewhere gentler still. A city called Bubastis, in the eastern delta, home to a goddess whose fierceness had, by the time most of the stories about her were written down, softened into something closer to companionship. This is the house of Batet. From lioness to housecat, Bastet's story shares real roots with Sekhmet's. In the earliest periods of Egyptian religion, she too was frequently depicted as a lioness, a fierce protective goddess associated, much like Sekhmet, with the dangerous power of Ra I sent out into the world. But over the long centuries of Egyptian history, particularly from the New Kingdom onward, Bastet's iconography gradually shifted, softening from the lioness form into something gentler and more domestic, a woman with the head of a cat, or simply a cat itself, often shown holding a small woven basket or a sistrum, a kind of ceremonial rattle associated with music and joy. This transformation wasn't random. As the small, agile domestic cat became an increasingly common and valued presence in Egyptian households, prized for protecting stored grain from rats and mice, and simply for the easy companionship cats have offered people in nearly every culture that's ever lived alongside them. Bastet's own image shifted to reflect that closer, gentler relationship. She remained a protector, the way Sekhmet remained one. But her protection took on a distinctly warmer, more intimate character. Not the fury of a plague sent against enemies, but the quiet, watchful presence of something curled by the hearth, alert enough to notice danger, calm enough to be trusted completely. The city Herodotus called the happiest. Bubastis, Bastet's primary cult center in the eastern Nile Delta, was, by the account of the Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled through Egypt and wrote about it extensively around 2,500 years ago, home to one of the most beloved and widely attended festivals in the entire country. Herodotus describes the temple itself with real admiration, built on raised ground, surrounded on nearly every side by canals, so that the sanctuary appeared almost as an island, approached by a grand processional avenue. According to his account, when the annual festival arrived, boats packed full of pilgrims traveled up the Nile from every part of Egypt to reach the city, and the journey itself became part of the celebration. Herodotus describes women aboard these boats playing castanets, men playing flutes, and everyone aboard singing and clapping as they traveled, with boats occasionally pulling close to riverside towns along the way so that some passengers could call out to local women on the shore, teasing and celebrating together before continuing on. By the time the pilgrims actually reached Bubastis itself, Herodotus claims that more wine was consumed during this single festival than during the entire rest of the year combined, and that the gathered crowds, by his estimate, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Whether every detail in his account is perfectly accurate, ancient historians, including Herodotus, We're not always working from first-hand precision, and this was written by an outsider describing another culture's celebration. The broader picture it paints feels true to what we know from other evidence. That Bastet's festival was joyful, widely loved, and drew Egyptians from every region together in one of the most genuinely festive religious occasions the ancient Nile ever saw. A city beneath the sand, full of small bodies. In the centuries following Bastet's rise to popularity, devotion to her took on a particular, remarkable form. The mummification of actual cats, offered by the thousands, even the millions, as votive gifts to the goddess. Archaeologists excavating the necropolis at Bubastis and at other sites across Egypt associated with cat cults have uncovered enormous quantities of cat mummies. Entire underground galleries filled with small, carefully wrapped bodies, some elaborately bandaged in beautiful geometric patterns, others simpler and more modest, reflecting what a particular pilgrim could afford to offer. Pilgrims visiting the temple could purchase a mummified cat, prepared specifically for this purpose by temple attendants who bred and raised cats, at least in later periods, in numbers substantial enough to meet the ongoing demand, and present it as an offering, a physical, tangible act of devotion left behind at the goddess's sanctuary. It's a practice that can feel startling to modern sensibilities, accustomed as many of us are to thinking of a pet cat as an individual, irreplaceable companion rather than a votive object. But within the Egyptian religious imagination, offering a cat's small body to Bastet wasn't a callous act. It was understood as an act of genuine devotion, a way of sending something beloved and sacred directly into the goddess's own keeping. A crime worth dying for. The reverence Egyptians held for cats more broadly. Not only the temple cats bred specifically for ritual purposes, but the ordinary cats living in ordinary households, comes through vividly in an account left by the later Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing several centuries after Herodotus. Diodorus describes an incident in which a Roman visitor to Egypt accidentally killed a cat, and the reaction from the local population was severe enough and immediate enough that Egyptian officials were reportedly unable to save the man from being killed by an outraged crowd. Despite Rome's considerable political influence in Egypt at the time and the potential diplomatic consequences of harming a Roman citizen. Whether every detail of that particular story holds up to modern historical scrutiny, it reflects something Egyptologists have found consistent evidence for elsewhere, that killing a cat, even accidentally, was treated with real seriousness in ancient Egypt, a genuine offense against something sacred rather than simply the loss of a household animal. Families are believed to have shaved their eyebrows in mourning when a household cat died naturally, a small, visible sign of grief worn openly for a period afterward, and cats that died were themselves often mummified and given proper burial, even outside temple contexts, simply as a matter of ordinary household devotion. The bowl left out after dark. Picture, then, an ordinary household on an ordinary night, somewhere along the Nile, while after the rest of the family has gone to sleep. Before the last lamp is extinguished, someone, a mother, most likely, tending to the small last tasks of the evening, sets out a shallow bowl of milk near the hearth, a quiet, unremarked gesture repeated so many times across a lifetime that it barely registers as a conscious act of devotion at all. It's simply what you do, the way you might latch a door or bank a fire before bed. And yet, in that small gesture, an entire theology is quietly present. The cat that pads softly across the packed earth floor toward that bowl isn't only a household pet, valuable for keeping the grain stores free of rats. It's understood, at least a little, as touched by something larger than itself, a small, warm, watchful incarnation of the same goddess whose grand temple at Bubastis drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims once a year, present here too, in the quietest, most ordinary room in the house, asking for nothing more than a little milk and a little warmth by the fire. There's something worth carrying into your own rest in that image. The sacred, in this household's understanding, didn't only live in grand temples and enormous festivals. It lived here too, in a small bowl set out after dark, in the soft, unhurried sound of something gentle finding its way home to warmth. Whatever quiet, small comfort you've arranged for yourself tonight, the specific weight of your blanket, the particular hush of the room around you, you're allowed to think of it the same way. Not a small thing. A small, sacred thing, exactly the size it needs to be. Two faces of the same eye. If you've been listening closely tonight, you may have already noticed how closely Bastet's story echoes the one we sat with an hour ago in Sekhmet's temple. That's not a coincidence. The Egyptians themselves frequently understood Bastet and Sekhmet as two expressions of the very same underlying force, the Eye of Ra, capable of being sent out into the world either as devastating, protective fury, or as gentle, watchful care, depending on what the moment required. In some periods and regions, the two goddesses were even worshipped as something close to sisters, or as two faces the same protective power could wear depending on the need of the hour. Sekhmet, fierce in Memphis, guarding the boundary between health and plague. Bastet, gentle in Bubastis, guarding the boundary between a household and whatever small dangers might slip in after dark. Neither face was considered the true one, with the other merely a lesser echo. Both were understood as equally real, equally necessary, simply suited to different moments, the way a single person might carry real strength and real softness both, without either one canceling the other out. I think that's a useful thing to hold on to, especially at this exact hour, exactly halfway through our long night together. You don't have to choose, permanently, between being someone who can face down whatever difficulty comes for you, and being someone who curls up gently by the hearth needing nothing more than warmth and a little milk left out in a bowl. The oldest religious imagination in recorded history didn't ask its own goddesses to choose either. It simply let them be both, fully, as the night required. The sound that kept the dark gentle. One last small detail before we let this chapter close. Bastet, like several other goddesses associated with music, joy, and protection, was closely linked with an instrument called the sistrum, a small, handheld rattle, usually made of bronze or faience, with loose metal discs strung across a frame that produced a soft, bright, shimmering sound when shaken. The sistrum wasn't used only for festival celebration, though it featured heavily there too. In the music and dancing Herodotus described aboard those crowded pilgrim boats. It was also understood as having a genuinely protective function, its bright, delicate sound believed capable of startling away hostile or chaotic forces, clearing the air, in a very literal sonic sense, before a ritual could properly begin. Temple attendants shook it gently at the start of ceremonies. Mothers, in some households, may well have kept a small version near a sleeping child. Its soft sound offered as one more small, deliberate layer of protection against whatever might otherwise disturb a peaceful night. I want you to imagine that sound now, faintly, somewhere at the edge of this chapter's end, small metal discs shivering softly together, bright and warm, clearing away whatever unhelpful thoughts might otherwise have followed you into sleep. You don't need an actual sistrum tonight. The sound of this story, unhurried and warm, moving gently from one small, cared-for detail to the next, can do exactly the same work, if you let it. Halfway through the night, we've now traveled through 6 full chapters of this long night together, from Nut's swallowing of the sun, through Khonsu's moonlit temple, Ta's silent workshops, Meskinet's birthing brick, Sekhmet's fevers finally breaking, and now Bastet's small bowl of milk left out in the dark. If you're still awake, we're exactly halfway through this journey, with 6 more chapters of temples and gods still ahead of us. Turquoise mines watched over by Hathor, sacred crocodile pools tended in Sobek's honor, a scribe's lamplit library kept for Thoth, the patient work of Anubis's embalmers, the sun's own long and dangerous voyage through the dark, and finally, the eternal green fields that Osiris and Isis promise waits for all of us, eventually, on the other side of every long night. Like this one. But if you've already drifted off somewhere in the last chapter or two, that's alright too. More than alright, really. That was always allowed. Nut is still holding the sky up above you either way. Bastet's small bowl is still set out by the hearth. The rest of this story will keep unfolding gently in the background, the way it always has, whether you're awake to hear every word of it or not. Chapter 7. Hathor and the Turquoise Expeditions. The desert holds its breath before dawn. Far from the green ribbon of the Nile, past the last acacia trees, past the last well, the land turns to stone and silence. This is the Sinai, a place of raw, ochre mountains and skies so vast they seem to press down on the earth like a lid. Here, there is no river to measure the hours by, no flood to mark the turning of seasons. There is only rock and wind, and the goddess who is said to live inside the mountain itself. They call her Hathor, Lady of Turquoise, Mistress of the West, the Golden One who dwells in stone. Let your breathing settle into the rhythm of a caravan moving slowly across sand. In and out. Slow and even. There is nowhere to rush to here. The desert does not reward haste. Before first light, in the small mining settlement of Serabit El Kavim, men rise from their sleeping mats laid out on cooling stone. The night air of the desert is surprisingly cold, a blue chill that clings to the skin even after the sun has begun to climb. They rise slowly, stretching stiff shoulders, rubbing sand from their eyes, murmuring to one another in low voices that seem to disappear instantly into the emptiness around them. These are not farmers. These are miners, men drawn from villages up and down the Nile, sent out under royal expedition to bring back the blue-green stone the Egyptians prized above almost anything except gold itself. Turquoise, the color of the sky at the exact moment it touches the horizon, the color the Egyptians associated with rebirth, with the promise of morning. And turquoise, they believed, belonged to Hathor. She was not, in this place, only the goddess of music and love and joyful drunkenness that she was worshipped as along the river. Here, at the edge of the world, she took on a harder, more elemental form. She became the mountain. She became the vein of blue stone hidden inside gray rock. She became the thing you had to earn through labor, through danger, through days spent chipping at stone in tunnels barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Picture the temple built in her honor here, carved directly into the flank of a hill overlooking the mining valley. It is not grand in the way the great temples of Thebes are grand. There are no towering pylons, no avenues of sphinxes. It is smaller, rougher, more intimate, built by the very hands of the men who worked the mines, stone by stone, offering by offering, across centuries. Before any man descended into the shafts, he came here first. Imagine the flicker of an oil lamp against carved rock. A miner kneels in the sand before a small stela, a stone slab inscribed with prayers left by those who came before him. He does not read the words, few miners could, but he knows their shape, their meaning passed down through repetition, through ritual, through the quiet instruction of older men who have made this same journey many times before. Hathor, Lady of Turquoise, Mistress of the West, let the stone yield gently. Let the rock not fall upon us. Let us return to our families with the blue stone in our hands and breath still in our chests. There is a particular kind of prayer that comes from people who work with danger every single day, and it is different from other prayers. It is not asking for glory. It is not asking for wealth beyond need. It is simply asking to come home, to see the sun set one more time, to feel a wife's hand, a child's small fingers, the ordinary warmth of a hearth fire after all this stone and silence. The mine shafts themselves are narrow, low, cut directly into the hillside by men working with copper chisels and stone hammers, inch by inch, over years. Descending into one is to leave the desert light behind entirely, to move into a darkness broken only by the small orange glow of clay lamps, their wicks soaked in oil, casting long trembling shadows against walls of pale limestone shot through with veins of blue-green stone. The air inside grows close and warm, filled with the scent of hot stone and burning oil and the sweat of men working in cramped, aching positions, kneeling, crouching, sometimes lying flat on their backs to chip at a seam of turquoise just above their heads. It is exhausting work. It is patient work. It requires a kind of devotion that has less to do with belief and more to do with simple endurance. The willingness to keep going, hour after hour, in the dark, for the sake of something beautiful that will one day adorn a queen's collar or a god statue far away on the green banks of the Nile. And yet, even here, in this hardest and most unglamorous corner of Egyptian religious life, joy finds a way in. Because Hathor, above all things, is the goddess of joy. At the end of a long expedition, sometimes lasting weeks, sometimes months, when the quotas were filled and the baskets of raw turquoise packed carefully in wool and cloth for the long journey home, the miners would gather at dusk before her temple for something the ancient texts describe almost tenderly, a festival in the middle of nowhere. Picture it. The desert sky deepening from orange to violet to a black scattered so thickly with stars it seems impossible, uncountable. A sky uncorrupted by any city's glow. A sky the men from the river valley rarely saw in such perfect clarity. Small fires are lit. Someone produces a hand drum, its skin worn soft from years of travel. Another has a simple reed pipe. There is beer, brought in clay jars specifically for this purpose. Its slightly sour fermented taste a small luxury after weeks of stale water and hard bread. And there is dancing. Even here, hundreds of miles from the temples of Dendera, where Hathor's great sanctuary stood, even here in the harsh mining camps of the Sinai, men who spent their days in the crushing dark of mountain tunnels would rise in the firelight and dance. Arms loose, feet moving in old familiar patterns, laughter rising up into that impossible desert sky. Because to honor Hathor was to remember that even hardship deserved its moments of lightness. That joy was not something you waited to deserve. It was something you took, deliberately, gratefully, whenever it was offered. Let this image settle over you now like a soft weight. Firelight on rock walls. The low murmur of a drum. Men who have spent their days in darkness, dancing beneath more stars than they have ever seen, in honor of a goddess who asked nothing more of them than to notice the beauty around them, even in the hardest of places. There is something almost unbearably tender in this. The idea that even in the loneliest outpost of an ancient civilization, thousands of miles from any river, any home, any softness, people still made room for music, still made room for dance, still lifted a cup of sour beer to the sky and thanked a goddess for the simple fact of being alive, to feel the cool desert night against their skin. Hathor was also, the priests believed, present in the stone itself. When a vein of particularly fine turquoise was uncovered, a deep, saturated blue-green, unmarked by gray or brown impurity, the miners would sometimes pause their work entirely, laying down chisels, and simply look at it in the lamplight. Some texts suggest they would murmur her name softly, as if greeting an old friend unexpectedly encountered in a strange place. There you are. This, perhaps, is the deepest truth of Hathor's presence in the desert. She was not only the goddess who was prayed to before danger. She was the goddess found within the beautiful thing itself, inside the stone, inside the color, inside the small, unexpected moment of wonder that could interrupt even the hardest labor. Consider the return journey. Weeks of walking, donkeys laden with baskets of stone, the mining camp shrinking behind them into the vastness of the desert, until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by heat shimmer and distance. Ahead, though invisible for many days yet, lay the river. The green fields. The mud-brick villages with their cooking fires and barking dogs and children who would run out to meet their fathers, uncles, brothers, returning sun-darkened and thinner than when they left, but alive. Always, the prayer was for that, alive. And in the temples along the Nile, when the turquoise finally arrived, carried by boat now, along the gentle current of the river, it would be fashioned by skilled craftsmen into collars and inlays and small sacred amulets, worn by queens, set into the eyes of statues, pressed into the golden funerary masks of the dead. Every piece carrying, invisibly, the memory of firelight and drums and men dancing beneath desert stars in gratitude to the goddess who let them come home. Breathe with that image now. Somewhere, far away in time, a piece of blue-green stone was pulled from darkness by careful, patient hands, blessed with music and dance beneath a sky full of stars, and carried gently home to become something beautiful. You do not need to remember any of the details. Only the feeling. Only the sense of something hard-won, cherished, and finally, safely, brought to rest. The desert grows quiet again in your mind now. The fires burn low. The dancing has slowed to a gentle sway, then stillness. One by one, the miners lie back on the still warm sand, faces turned up toward that impossibly dense field of stars, and let sleep take them, the way it is beginning, now, to take you. Chapter 8. Sobuk and the Sacred Pools of the Fayum. The Nile does not simply flow. It breathes. Once each year, it swells, rising slowly from the deep interior of Africa, carrying with it the dark, rich silt that will feed an entire civilization for another 12 months. The Egyptians called this the inundation, and they understood, with a clarity that modern life has largely forgotten, that their survival depended entirely on forces far larger and older than themselves. And of all the forces that lived within that great, life-giving, occasionally violent river, none commanded more careful respect than Sobek, the crocodile god, lord of the waters, a being of raw, ancient power, older in some tellings than the more familiar gods of the Egyptian pantheon, a power that predated order itself, present at the river's edge since before the first temple was built. Let your body settle now, heavy and warm, the way it settles into water that has been gently warmed by the sun. This chapter moves slowly, the way the Fayum's canals move slowly, the way still water moves when there is nowhere urgent for it to go. South and west of the main course of the Nile lies a great natural depression in the earth, a green oasis fed by a channel of the river's water, the Fayum. Unlike the narrow ribbon of cultivation that lines the Nile itself, the Fayum opens outward into wide lakes and marshes, a lush, watery landscape thick with reeds and papyrus, alive with birds, fish, and, above all, crocodiles. Here stood Shedet, a city the Greeks would later call Crocodilopolis, the city of crocodiles, because here, more than anywhere else in Egypt, the sacred crocodile was not merely honored in statue and story, but kept, fed, and adorned in living, breathing form. Picture the sacred pool at the heart of the temple complex. Wide, still, its surface reflecting the pale gold of the afternoon sky, broken only by the occasional slow ripple as something ancient shifts just beneath the surface. Around its edges, stone steps lead down into the water, worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps. The priests of Sobek's temple were, among their many duties, keepers of these sacred crocodiles, a role that required a particular blend of reverence and practical skill unlike almost any other in the Egyptian priesthood. Imagine a priest kneeling at the water's edge in the late afternoon light, a woven basket beside him filled with fresh fish and small cuts of meat, calling out in a low, steady voice. Not a shout, never a shout, but a calm, rhythmic murmur that the sacred animals had, over years of careful conditioning, come to associate with feeding, with safety, with the presence of those who cared for them. Slowly, from the reeds at the pool's far edge, a shape moves. Then another. The water barely stirs as they approach. An economy of motion that speaks to immense, coiled strength held carefully in check. These are not wild, hunting animals in this moment. They have been raised from hatchlings within temple grounds, handled since they were small enough to be held in two cupped hands, and something in that long relationship with human care has settled into them a kind of trust, cautious, ancient, but real. The priests would adorn the temple's most sacred crocodile, the one believed to be the living vessel of Sobek's presence on earth, with gold rings around its front legs and gemstone pendants set into its ears, and bracelets of gold and semi-precious stone fitted carefully around its powerful, scaled forelimbs. Picture the low, patient work of this. Two priests moving with unhurried care, murmuring softly, fastening delicate golden ornaments onto an animal capable, in an instant, of ending a human life, and doing so not out of foolish bravery, but out of deep, practiced familiarity, the way one might handle a beloved but powerful animal one has known for years. When the sacred crocodile eventually died, as all living things do, it would be mummified with the same painstaking care given to a pharaoh, wrapped in fine linen, its face sometimes covered in a gilded mask, and laid to rest in specially prepared tombs. Then, in a ceremony of quiet solemnity, a new hatchling would be selected and consecrated in its place. The god's presence, the Egyptians believed, moving fluidly from one living vessel to the next, never truly absent from the world, only renewed. There is something worth resting on here, in this idea. That power does not have to be resisted or destroyed to be honored. That the crocodile, capable of violence, capable of death, feared along every riverbank and canal in Egypt, could also be adorned with gold, spoken to gently, fed by hand, and mourned when it died. The Egyptians did not ask their gods to be only gentle. They understood, with a wisdom worth carrying into your own rest tonight, that true power is often both dangerous and necessary. that the same river which could drown a careless traveler was the very same river whose flooding fed an entire nation for another year. Life and danger, in this worldview, were never fully separable. And so devotion did not mean pretending the danger away. It meant learning to live alongside it with respect. Beyond the temple walls, in the fields and villages that spread outward from the sacred lakes, ordinary farmers held their own quieter relationship with Sobek, one shaped less by golden bracelets and sacred pools, and more by simple, practical fear and hope. Imagine a farmer standing at the edge of his fields in the weeks before the flood is due to arrive, watching the horizon, waiting. The entire rhythm of his year, when to plant, when to harvest, whether his family will eat well or go hungry, depends on how generous or how withholding the coming inundation will be. Too little water, and the fields crack and starve. Too much, and villages are swept away, granaries destroyed, livestock drowned. Before the water arrives, he might travel to a small local shrine. Not the great temple of Crocodilopolis itself, but one of the countless smaller sanctuaries scattered along canal edges throughout the region. Simple mud brick structures housing a modest stone image of Sobek, crocodile-headed, seated, watchful. He brings a small offering, bread, perhaps, or a jar of beer, or a handful of dates, and murmurs a prayer that has been passed down through generations of farmers before him. Lord of the flood waters, be generous but not cruel this year. Rise high enough to feed the soil. Do not rise so high that you take what you have given. There is a particular vulnerability in this kind of prayer, the vulnerability of people whose entire survival depends on forces they cannot control, only hope to appease. And Sobek, in this context, was not a distant abstract power but something closer, more immediate. The crocodile sunning itself on the muddy bank near where children fetched water, the sudden violent ripple in an otherwise calm canal, the reminder, present every single day, that the river which gave life could also take it. As evening settles over the Fayum in your mind now, picture the sacred lake growing still and dark, its surface catching the last amber light of the setting sun. The temple priests have finished their evening feeding. The crocodiles have retreated to the warm mud of the shallows, barely visible now. Only the faint gleam of an eye-catching torchlight now and then along the water's edge. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, a farmer walks home along a canal path. The day's work finished, his prayers offered, his fate, as it always has been, as it always will be, for one more season, resting in the hands, or perhaps more accurately the jaws, of forces far older and larger than himself. Let the sound of water lapping gently against mud brick steps settle into you now. Let it become, if you can, the sound of your own breath, slow, rhythmic, patient, the way the Nile itself moves toward the sea without hurry, without doubt, carrying everything it needs to carry, all the way to morning. Chapter 9. Thoth and the House of Life. By the time the temple lamps are lit, the rest of the city has already gone quiet. Beyond the outer walls of the great temple complex, cooking fires have burned down to embers, children have been carried to sleeping mats, and the narrow streets of the town lie empty beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars. But here, inside a modest, unassuming building attached to the temple's outer courts, a different kind of quiet holds sway. Not the quiet of sleep, but the quiet of concentration. This is the Parank, the House of Life. Let this chapter settle over you like the hush of a room where important, careful work is being done, a room where voices are naturally lowered, where movements become deliberate and unhurried, simply because the atmosphere itself seems to demand it. The House of Life was not a temple to a god in the way the great sanctuaries were, with their towering statues and daily processions. It was something quieter, and in its own way, something the Egyptians considered just as sacred, a scriptorium, a library, a school, and an archive all at once, where the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization was copied, preserved, studied, and passed down, generation after careful generation. And presiding over all of it, in image and in spirit, was Thoth, ibis-headed, calm-eyed, depicted always with a reed pen in hand and a palette of ink resting nearby. Thoth was the god of writing itself, of wisdom, of the moon's slow and precise measurement of time. It was Thoth, the Egyptians believed, who had invented hieroglyphs in the first age of the world, who recorded the deeds of gods and men alike, who would one day stand beside the scales in the hall of judgment to record, with perfect and impartial accuracy, the verdict of a soul's heart. Picture the interior of the house of life at night, illuminated by rows of small clay lamps set at careful intervals along low writing tables. The air smells of burning oil, of papyrus, of the faint mineral scent of ink made from soot and gum Arabic, mixed fresh each evening in small stone pallets. Here, seated cross-legged on woven mats, a young scribe bends low over a sheet of papyrus, reed brush held at a precise angle, copying, character by careful character, a medical text passed down from scribes who lived centuries before he was born. His movements are slow, deliberate. A single mistake, a single misplaced sign, could alter the meaning of a treatment, a prayer, a historical record that future generations would rely upon as truth. Beside him, an older scribe, his teacher, his supervisor, a man who has spent perhaps 30 years within these same walls, watches with a patient, practiced eye, occasionally leaning over to murmur a correction, a suggestion, a small piece of guidance passed on the way it was once passed on to him. The training of a scribe began young, often as early as age 5 or 6, and continued for many years. Boys, for it was almost always boys, though there is evidence some daughters of scribes learned to read and write as well, would spend hours each day practicing the careful strokes of hieroglyphic and hieratic script on broken pieces of pottery or flakes of limestone before ever being trusted with the precious papyrus itself. Imagine the patience this required. Row after row of the same character, copied and recopied until the hand moved without conscious thought, until the shape of each sign became as familiar as the shape of one's own fingers. There is a kind of meditative repetition in this that the Egyptians themselves seemed to understand and even honor. The house of life was not only a place of urgent, important work, but a place where the very act of careful, repeated practice was itself a form of devotion to Thoth. Within the house of life, scribes preserved an extraordinary range of knowledge. Sacred hymns and temple rituals, yes, the words that priests would speak before the gods each morning, copied and recopied so that not a single syllable would be lost across generations. But also medical texts, describing symptoms and treatments with a precision that still impresses physicians today. Astronomical records, tracking the movement of stars and the rising of specific constellations that marked the passing of seasons. Historical annals, recording the reigns of kings, the heights of the Nile's flood each year, the building of monuments. Even simple, practical documents, contracts, letters, tax records, the ordinary paperwork of a functioning civilization. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what was being protected within these quiet walls. In a world without printing presses, without any means of mass duplication, every single copy of every single text existed because a human hand, working by lamplight, had copied it, letter by letter, from an older copy that was itself growing fragile with age. Papyrus, for all its usefulness, does not last forever. It grows brittle, it can be eaten by insects, it can be damaged by damp or fire or simple careless handling. The only way knowledge survived across centuries was through this patient, unglamorous, essential work, copying and copying again and copying again. This is why Thoth was honored not as a distant, abstract deity, but almost as a colleague, a fellow scribe, present in spirit at every writing table, watching over every careful stroke of the reed pen. Small statues of Thoth in his ibis form were often kept on writing tables, or even carried by scribes as personal amulets, a quiet reminder of the god who shared their patient, careful work. Picture now the evening ritual with which many scribes ended their working hours, a small offering left before a modest shrine to Thoth within the house of life itself. A few drops of ink poured out, a murmured thanks for the steadiness of the hand, for eyes that had not yet grown too tired to see clearly by lamplight, for knowledge safely preserved for one more night. Thoth, Lord of the divine words, keeper of what must not be forgotten, guide my hand and keep these words true. There is something in this prayer worth carrying with you now, into whatever rest awaits you. The idea that carefulness itself can be a form of prayer, that the slow, patient, unglamorous work of preservation, of getting something right, of protecting what matters from being lost, is its own kind of sacred act, deserving of its own quiet reverence. As the night deepens in your mind now, imagine the house of life slowly emptying. One by one, the young scribes finish their evening's work, carefully rolling their papyrus sheets, setting aside their reed pens, extinguishing the small lamps that lit their tables. The older scribe makes his final rounds, checking that each precious document has been properly stored in its clay jar or wooden box, safe from damp, safe from insects, safe for one more night. Outside, the moon, Thoth's own domain, the slow celestial clock by which the god was said to measure all of time, hangs high and pale above the temple walls, its light falling softly through open windows onto rows of empty writing tables, onto neat stacks of papyrus scrolls resting quietly in the dark, holding within them centuries of careful human effort to remember, to preserve, to pass forward. Let your own mind grow as quiet now as that emptied room. Let whatever thoughts have been circling through your day settle gently onto the page, be copied down carefully, and then, like the scribes themselves, be allowed, finally, to rest. Chapter 10. Anubis and the Quiet Work of the Embalmers. There is a tent at the edge of the desert, where the cultivated green of the Nile Valley gives way to pale sand and silence. This is not a place of fear, though the modern mind, shaped by different stories, might expect it to be. This is a place of extraordinary, patient devotion, the Wabbit, the pure place, where the embalmers of ancient Egypt carried out the most careful and demanding craft of their civilization, under the watchful presence of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. Let your body soften now, completely, the way linen softens after long, careful handling. This is a chapter about stillness, about patience, about the particular kind of tenderness that can exist in work devoted entirely to care. To understand Anubis, it helps to set aside modern associations with death, the fear, the avoidance, the sense of something to be rushed past or hidden away. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an ending to be feared so much as a threshold to be carefully, respectfully crossed. And Anubis, present at that threshold, was not a figure of dread, but a figure of profound gentleness. The god who had, according to myth, performed the very first embalming himself, tending to the body of Osiris with such skill and devotion that the god was restored to a kind of eternal life. Every embalmer who worked within the Wabbit understood themselves to be performing, quite literally, the work of Anubis. Some embalmers, in fact, wore a jackal-headed mask during the most sacred stages of the process, becoming, for those hours, a living vessel for the god's own careful hands. Picture the interior of the embalmer's tent, illuminated by soft lamplight, the air thick with the scent of natron salt and sweet resins, of cedar oil and frankincense, of linen that has been carefully perfumed before use. This was not, contrary to what modern imagination sometimes assumes, an unpleasant place. Enormous care was taken, throughout the 70-day process, to ensure that the space remained one of dignity, of sweetness, of quiet reverence. The process itself unfolded slowly, deliberately, over more than 2 months, a timeline that mirrored, the Egyptians believed, the 70 days that the star Sirius disappeared from the night sky each year before its dramatic return, a celestial rehearsal of death and rebirth playing out above the very tent where human bodies were being prepared for their own journey into the next world. In the first days, the body would be washed with palm wine and river water, an act of purification carried out with slow, careful hands. Then came the long process of drying, using natron, a naturally occurring salt harvested from dry lake beds in the desert, packed carefully around and within the body, drawing out moisture over the course of 40 days. Imagine an embalmer kneeling beside the body during this stage, checking the natron periodically, replacing it as needed, murmuring low prayers throughout, not out of obligation, but because these words had become, through years of practice, as natural and necessary a part of the work as the physical handling itself. Anubis, guide these hands. Let nothing be rushed. Let nothing be forgotten. Let this body be made ready to walk again beneath the stars of the next world. There is a particular kind of intimacy in this work that is easy to overlook if one focuses only on its unfamiliar, technical aspects. The embalmers were, in a very real sense, caregivers, tending to a person who could no longer tend to themselves, ensuring that every part of them was treated with the same dignity they would have wished for in life. Organs removed during the process were not discarded, but carefully preserved in their own containers, wrapped in their own linen, treated with the same reverence as the body itself, because the Egyptians believed every part of a person mattered, that nothing about a beloved individual should simply be thrown away. After the 40 days of drying, the long process of wrapping would begin, and this stage, more than any other, reveals the extraordinary patience embalmers brought to their craft. Fine linen, sometimes hundreds of yards of it, cut into long strips and carefully wound around each finger individually, each toe, each limb, before the wrapping moved to encompass the whole body. Picture the slow, rhythmic motion of this work, an embalmer's hands moving in careful loops, layer after layer, sometimes pausing to insert a protective amulet between the layers of linen at precisely the right point on the body, murmuring the specific prayer associated with that particular amulet as it was placed. A scarab over the heart, to ensure it would not testify falsely against its owner in the judgment to come. A protective eye, for guidance in darkness. Small figures of gods, tucked carefully at the fingertips, at the throat, at the brow. Each one a small, deliberate act of protection, wrapped in with love and expertise into the very fabric surrounding the body. This was not fast work, and it was never meant to be. Every strip of linen, every knot, every murmured prayer, represented a small unit of care, repeated thousands of times over the course of the wrapping process, until finally the body lay wrapped and ready, resembling, in its smooth, careful linen shape, something almost peaceful, almost sleeping. Consider, for a moment, what it must have meant to the families of ancient Egypt to know that their loved ones were being tended to in this way. Not rushed into the ground, not treated as a problem to be solved quickly, but held, quite literally, in careful hands for over 2 months, wrapped in prayer and perfumed linen, prepared with the kind of patience usually reserved only for the most precious, most cherished things. There is comfort available here, if you allow yourself to receive it. The idea that endings, even the final ending each of us will eventually face, do not have to be frightening or rushed or hidden away. That they can instead be met with patience, with careful hands, with the quiet, steady presence of someone or something devoted entirely to ensuring that nothing about you, about your particular existence, is lost or forgotten or treated carelessly. At the very final stage of the process, once the wrapping was complete, a ritual known as the opening of the mouth would be performed, a ceremony in which priests, using special ceremonial tools, would symbolically restore the senses to the wrapped body. The ability to see, to hear, to breathe, to speak, to eat in the next world. It was believed that only after this ritual could the deceased truly awaken into their new existence, whole and complete, ready to begin their journey. Let this image settle over you gently now, as the chapter draws to its close. A body, wrapped with 70 days of patient care, resting finally in quiet lamplight, protected by amulets tucked lovingly between layers of linen, watched over throughout by the steady, gentle presence of Anubis. Not a figure to fear, but a guide, a caretaker, the one who ensures that nothing about you is rushed, that nothing about you is lost, that you are held completely and carefully, for exactly as long as you need to be held, before you are finally, gently, allowed to rest. Chapter 11. Ra's Journey Through the Duet. Somewhere above you now, in whatever room holds your body as you listen, the same sun that Nut swallowed at the beginning of this story is continuing its ancient, unbroken journey. We return now to the question this film began with. Where does the sun go when it disappears beneath the horizon each evening? What happens in those long hours between sunset and sunrise, when the world above lies dark and Nut's star-covered body arches silently overhead? The Egyptians had an answer, and it is one of the most extraordinary, most quietly courageous stories their civilization ever told. Let your body grow heavier now, sinking further into whatever surface holds you, the way the sun itself sinks each evening into the western horizon, not ending, the Egyptians believed, but simply beginning a different kind of journey. Each night, as the sun god Ra completed his day's passage across the sky, he did not cease to exist, did not vanish into nothing. Instead, he boarded a great solar bark, a ship built not for water but for the deep darkness beneath the world, and began a journey through the Duat, the underworld, the hidden realm through which the sun had to pass before it could be reborn each morning in the east. Picture this bark now, gliding silently through absolute darkness, its hull carved with protective symbols, illuminated only by the faint golden glow of Ra himself, seated at its center. Though in this form, traveling through the underworld, he often took the shape of a ram-headed figure, a form associated with hidden power, with the mysterious potential held within apparent stillness. The journey was divided, in Egyptian belief, into 12 hours, each one representing a distinct region of the underworld, populated by its own strange landscapes, its own trials, its own beings both helpful and dangerous. In the first hours, the bark passed through territories still touched by echoes of the living world above, the sounds of the day fading slowly into silence, the light dimming gradually into true darkness. Guardian deities lined the passage, some benevolent, some watchful and stern, each one requiring the correct words, the correct knowledge, to pass safely. Deeper into the night's journey, the landscape grew stranger. The bark passed through caverns of fire, through realms where the souls of the blessed dead labored peacefully in eternal fields, through territories governed by serpent guardians and strange hybrid beings that defied simple description. Throughout it all, a crew of protective deities traveled alongside Ra, gods whose sole purpose was to ensure his safe passage, to fight beside him against the dangers that lurked in the deepest hours of the night. And chief among those dangers, waiting in the very depths of the journey, was Apophis. Apophis was not a god in the way the other deities of Egypt were gods. He was something older, something that existed before the ordered world itself. A vast, chaotic serpent representing not evil exactly, in the way later religious traditions would understand that word, but rather Isfit. Chaos, disorder, the raw undoing force that constantly threatened to unravel the careful balance. Ma'at, upon which the entire universe depended. Each night, somewhere in the deepest, darkest hour of Ra's journey, the solar bark would encounter Apophis, coiled and waiting in the black waters of the underworld river, vast beyond imagining, capable, if he succeeded, of swallowing the sun whole and plunging the world into permanent, unending night. Picture this confrontation now, not as a scene of terror, but as an ancient, familiar ritual, a battle that had been fought every single night since the beginning of time, and that would be fought every single night until time itself ended. Ra was never alone in this fight. Beside him stood Set, a god whose complicated, often difficult reputation in other myths gave way, in this particular story, to his role as protector, standing at the prow of the solar bark with spear raised, driving back the great serpent's assault. Other deities joined the fight as well, the goddess Isis with her powerful words of magic, the god Horus in his falcon form, adding their strength to the nightly defense. The battle would rage through the darkest hour, chaos straining against order, the ancient serpent's coils thrashing against the sides of the bark, until finally, as it always had, as it always would, order prevailed. Apophis, wounded but never permanently destroyed, for chaos, the Egyptians understood, could never be fully eliminated from the world, only held back, night after night, through continued effort, would retreat back into the darkness, and the solar bark would continue on, carrying Ra toward the final hours of his journey. There is something profound worth sitting with here, in this idea that even the sun itself, the most powerful, most reliable force in the ancient Egyptian world, the very thing that made all life on Earth possible, required nightly struggle simply to continue existing. That safety, that continuity, that the simple fact of tomorrow's sunrise was not something to be taken for granted, but something actively fought for, hour after hour, in the deepest darkness, by gods working together in devoted, coordinated effort. Perhaps there is comfort available in this too, if you allow it. The idea that struggle in the dark hours does not mean something has gone wrong. That difficulty faced at night, in the depths of uncertainty, is not a sign of failure, but simply part of an ancient, necessary rhythm, one that has always, eventually, given way to light. As the 12th and final hour of the journey approached, the solar bark would pass through the body of a great serpent representing rebirth itself, entering in through its tail and emerging, transformed, from its mouth. A journey that mirrored, in its final moments, the very image with which this entire film began: passage through darkness, through the body of something vast and ancient, toward eventual, certain rebirth. And there, at the threshold between the deepest night and the coming dawn, Ra would emerge once more into the world above, not as the same form he had carried through the darkness, but transformed, renewed, rising now as Khepri, the scarab-headed god of the rising sun, pushing the new day's light up over the eastern horizon the way a scarab beetle pushes its ball of dung across the sand. An image the Egyptians found not humble, but profound. A small, humble creature's daily labor mirroring the cosmos's own grand, continuous act of renewal. This, then, is the answer to the question this film asked at its very beginning. The sun does not vanish when Nut swallows it each evening. It travels, instead, through darkness, through struggle, through the deep and necessary hours of the night, protected and accompanied all the while, fighting chaos back with the same quiet persistence it has shown every single night since the world began, until finally, inevitably, gloriously, it is born again. Let this knowledge settle over you now as you continue your own descent into rest. Whatever darkness the night ahead might hold for you is not empty. It is not without purpose. It is simply the necessary passage, accompanied, protected, ancient, and utterly certain to end, as it always has, in light. Chapter 12, Osiris, Isis, and the Field of Reeds. We come now to the end of the story, which is also, as all true endings are, a beginning. Let everything in you soften completely now. Whatever tension remains in your shoulders, your jaw, the small muscles around your eyes, let it dissolve, the way morning mist dissolves off the surface of the Nile once the sun climbs high enough to warm the water beneath it. This final chapter belongs to Osiris, god of the afterlife, ruler of the dead, and the central figure in the most important myth ancient Egypt ever told about what happens after we die. The story begins, as many origin stories do, with both harmony and tragedy intertwined. Osiris, in the earliest age of the world, ruled as a wise and beloved king, bringing agriculture, law, and civilization to Egypt alongside his devoted wife and sister, Isis. But his brother, Set, consumed by jealousy, murdered Osiris and scattered pieces of his body across the land. What follows is one of the most tender acts of devotion in all of ancient mythology. Isis, refusing to accept her husband's death as final, traveled across Egypt gathering the scattered pieces of his body, one by one, with a patience and love that mirrors, in its way, the careful work of the embalmers we heard of earlier in this story. Using her considerable magic, and with the help of Anubis himself, she reassembled Osiris's body, wrapped it in the very first linen bandages ever used, and through the sheer force of her devotion and her magical skill, breathed a kind of life back into him. Not the life of the living world, but a new kind of existence entirely. Eternal, transformed, ruling now not over the world of the living, but over the world of the dead. From that moment forward, Osiris became the king of the afterlife, and every soul that died in Egypt would eventually stand before him, hoping to be judged worthy of the eternal paradise he now presided over. Picture now the Hall of Judgment, deep within the Duat, where every soul, at the end of its earthly life, must eventually come. The hall is vast, dimly lit, its walls lined with silent, watchful gods. At its center stands a great golden scale, and it is here that the most famous moment of the entire Egyptian afterlife takes place, the weighing of the heart. The heart, the Egyptians believed, was the seat of a person's conscience, their memory, their true character. Everything about who they had been in life, held not in the mind but in this single organ, carefully preserved during mummification precisely because it would be needed for this moment. Picture the heart, small and quiet, placed gently on one side of the great scale. On the other side rests a single white feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. For a soul to pass successfully into the eternal paradise beyond, their heart must weigh no more, and no less, than this single feather. It must be light, unburdened by cruelty, by greed, by the accumulated weight of a life lived carelessly or unkindly toward others. Anubis himself, present here too, in this final and most important role, carefully adjusts the scale, ensuring perfect balance, perfect fairness. And Thoth, the same patient god of writing we spent an earlier chapter with, the careful keeper of records, stands ready with his reed pen, prepared to record the verdict with the same meticulous accuracy he brought to every scroll copied within the House of Life. Before the weighing itself, the soul would recite what scholars now call the negative confession, a long list of wrongs they could honestly say they had not committed in life. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain to another without cause. I have not been deaf to words of truth. I have not made anyone weep. Not a boast of great achievements, notice, but something quieter, and in its way, more meaningful. A simple accounting of harm avoided, of basic decency maintained, day after ordinary day, throughout an entire lifetime. If the heart balanced evenly against the feather, light, unburdened, true, the soul would be welcomed by Osiris himself into the paradise that awaited, the field of reeds. Let yourself picture this now, as the final image this long story has to offer. The field of reeds, called, in the ancient texts, Aru, was imagined not as some abstract, unfamiliar heaven, but as Egypt itself, perfected. The same green fields along the same gentle river. But here, the flood never failed, the harvest never disappointed, the grain grew taller and more golden than any earthly wheat had ever grown. Here, the dead could farm as they had in life, could rest in the shade of familiar trees, could be reunited with family members who had crossed over before them, could live in a state of endless, peaceful abundance, the anxieties and hardships of mortal life finally, permanently set aside. It was, in essence, the ordinary made eternal, not some strange, unfamiliar paradise requiring the soul to become something entirely new, but simply life itself, the gentle, familiar rhythm of the Nile's seasons, the comfort of home and harvest and family, continued forever, without loss, without ending, without fear. And what of a heart that did not balance? What of a soul whose life had left it heavy with cruelty or dishonesty? Egyptian myth speaks of a creature called Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, waiting patiently beside the scale, who would consume a heart found too heavy, ending that soul's existence entirely. But notice, if you will, how rarely this fate seems to have been dwelt upon in the actual funerary texts left behind. The overwhelming focus, again and again, across thousands of years of Egyptian religious practice, was not on fear of failure, but on hope, on the deep, abiding belief that a life lived with basic honesty and kindness would be rewarded with peace. We come, now, full circle. Remember, if you can, the very beginning of this long night's journey. Nut, the sky goddess, arching her star-covered body over the sleeping earth, swallowing the sun each evening only to give birth to it again each dawn. You have traveled across these 12 chapters, through temples and mining camps, through birthing rooms and embalming tents, through the deepest hours of the underworld itself, alongside a civilization that spent thousands of years thinking carefully, tenderly, about what it means to live well and what might await afterward. And here, at the very end, the answer these ancient people arrived at was this: that death is not an ending to be feared, but a threshold, carefully guarded, patiently prepared for, gently crossed, leading, for those who lived with an unburdened heart, not into darkness, but into a green and peaceful field, familiar as home, endless as the river itself. You are still here, now, beneath Nut's star-covered body, exactly where this story began. The night is not yet over, but you understand now, in a way you perhaps did not at the very beginning, what her swallowing of the sun each evening truly promises. Not an ending, a passage, a patient journey through darkness, accompanied the whole way by careful, devoted presences toward a certain, gentle, golden rebirth. Let yourself rest now, completely, inside that promise. The stars continue to turn slowly overhead. The river continues its ancient, patient flow toward the sea. And you, held safely within all of it, may finally, fully, let go. Sleep now. Good night, traveler. Until we meet again.